paid round Abbottson fees on life support.
That is not only frustrating,
Mr. Provis, who hit you?
but also moving.
Are they in this courtroom?
Superb Australian drama.
They nearly killed him. Stuff it, we're knocking it now.
Janus, 8:30 Thursday, ABC.
In its 50th year and after 5 federal election defeats, the Liberal Party of Australia held a leadership ballot.
We have a new leader. The Liberal Party is Alexander Downer. In the case of the deputy leader...
Yes, sir, hold us.
The youth generation has taken over. John Hewson has lost this day. Mr. Fraser, in Melbourne, this was your prediction and it's come right.
Well, I'm delighted. I think
it's a clear decision that has been made, and I think the important thing is that now the decision is made, we go on and put all our efforts into winning that next election.
I am born of the Liberal Party. I am a creature of the Liberal Party, and the Liberal Party has always been a common-sense, practical political party. It's not institutions...
Alexander Downer is the 4th leader in 5 years. His 3 predecessors lost the job because they failed with the voters.
I didn't convince enough of them in March 1993 to vote for us, but we came very, very close.
Under my leadership, we will win government and get on with the task of nation building.
Well, we start off by trying to win.
Yes.
Where
do we go from there?
Well, let's win first.
For its first 20 years, the party had just one leader. Liberal leaders carry great expectations, for ultimately they're all measured against the victories of that one man. Party founder, Sir Robert Menzies.
Friends, I have tonight accepted nomination to stand for Parliament in the Coringal by-election.
Are you going to let him get away with that?
Although I should welcome a fight, my committee assures me that my return will be unopposed.
Right. I'm just a plain farmer. The only society I ever mix with is the cooperative society. But Mr. Webster's going to find that it's one thing to stand for Parliament and another thing to sit in it. His committee tell him he will be returned unopposed. That's wrong. I'm going to oppose it.
In 1940, film comedy Dad Rudd MP championed the little bloke fighting the politics of vested interest. At the time, conservative politics in Australia were losing support. The forerunner of the Liberal Party was the United Australia Party, the 5th separate Conservative party to hold government since Federation. Now, as Australians marched to war, the UAP was falling apart.
Oddly enough, the Liberal Party now reminds me very, very much of the old United Australia Party that the Liberal Party superseded in 1944, because that was, we seem to have got, after 50 years, into exactly the same situation.
The UAP was a peculiar mixture, and they didn't represent the people as such. And they were controlled by what was then known as National Union. and National Union was a very tight group of businessmen.
My father would say things to me as a child like, never listen to the advice of business people. They're not wise people. They're people who are self-serving. I think my father's views on business very much reflected Menzies' views as well. He, I think, learnt from the experience of the United Australia Party, which simply grew so close to business that it became really the UAP became the political wing of the business community.
If the UAP did not meet the popular mood, nor was its leader, Robert Gordon Menzies, a man of the people.
He didn't suffer fools gladly then, and I think was liable to be a bit abrupt and cut people off without really giving consideration to their feelings.
He had this wonderful wit, but it was a hurtful wit. And he had to learn to use his wit without being hurtful, and it was a very difficult thing for him to do.
I remember once as a very young boy, Menzies would use the government members' room to put on his 8mm movies that he took when he made trips to England. And I can remember all the remarks made around the room as Menzies was sort of upstaging everybody with these movies, and he was a bit of an upstart in those days. He had an air of arrogance about him.
In 1941, Menzies returned as Prime Minister from wartime London. UAP colleagues greeted him, but in reality, the party was tearing itself to pieces.
I come back to Australia with just one sick feeling in my heart, and that is that I must now come back to my own country and play politics. I think that it's a diabolical thing that anybody should have.
Menzies was deposed from the leadership. The UAP splintered and lost government to John Curtin's Labour Party.
He then was the first Prime Minister in wartime to be dismissed or forced to resign by his own party. And we treated him as a bit of a joke.
I was too young to be aware of it, except that feeling of gloom in the household and almost misery, I suppose. The fact that his own people had turned against him, I think he found very hard.
Since the government's announcement that clothing rationing was contemplated before...
By 1943, Australia was enduring the sacrifices of wartime.
Extraordinary scenes of panic buying. Scores acted like panicky Latins. For instance, the woman of 60 who bought 17 evening dresses of a type she herself could never wear, possibly with a little black market trading in view.
In the 43 election, the UAP provided neither vision nor hope. The Conservatives were trounced by the Curtin Labour government.
The old UAP was finished, that was washed up. The election had been lost. The party, very much like it is now, didn't seem to have any nerve of policy.
Despairing of the UAP, Menzies had already set about reinventing non-Labour politics. In 1942, he gave a series of radio broadcasts defining his political constituency.
The kind of people I myself represent in Parliament, salary earners, shopkeepers, skilled artisans, professional men and women, farmers, and so on. These are, in the political and economic sense, the middle class. They are, for the most part, unorganized and unself-conscious.
Identifying a constituency was one thing, creating policy was another. For economic theory, Menzies drew on a private institute run by political advisor Charles Kemp.
The vital thing was to restore people's faith in a private enterprise economy. Many in the business community were advocating a return to laissez-faire policies, but these were not credible to most people in the community. The new party had to both, on the one hand, support a private enterprise economy based on individual effort and achievement, but also concede that government had a key role.
The first Liberal Unity Conference was in October 1944, when 18 Conservative groups came to Canberra. Then, in December, delegates arrived by train at Albury on the New South Wales border to thrash out a new party. The Liberals would be a federation of state parties, structured to accommodate both national unity and state rivalries.
Mr Menzies thought it was far better to have the conference in a small country town where the finger couldn't be pointed one way or the other. I mean, there was always a bit of an ill feeling between New South Wales and Victoria. I suppose there still is.
The Liberal Party would aim for mass membership to escape the reliance on business. The largest and wealthiest foundation group was the Australian Women's National League, which already had 40,000 members.
The Australian Women's National League women had some money, and a lot of the big financial people were still supporting the UAP and were not convinced that Menzies could form a new party, because he called it the Liberal Party, which of course was more liberal than the Conservative Party. And my understanding is that those women only agreed to support him, Menzies, in the formation of the new party as long as the women were voted in and got equal representation in the organisation.
I set off to form form branches throughout the state, really, and quite a number of them. I don't say I formed every branch in Tasmania, but I thought, well, now what do you do? I then worked out a plan for myself, and that was that I would go to a little country area, ring up a friend I knew, perhaps at Huonville or Sorrel or Buckland, and ask her, would she invite a few of her friends to the Liberal Party.
My home is where my wife and children are. The instinct to be with them is the instinct of civilized man. The instinct to give them a chance in life is a noble instinct, not to make them leaners, but lifters.
If he could get the women to understand what he was talking about, he would get their vote. I think a lot of women voted for him, and when their husbands voted Labor.
The women's section was part of what was described as the Liberal machine, or really the Liberal machine were people like my mum and my grandmother, who when Mr Bolte, as he then was, or Mr Menzies, as he then was, called an election, they would just go over to their cupboards, pull out the books from the previous election, go to the respective hospitals and the people they'd done postal votes, and before the Labor Party could get going, all these women had covered the constituencies with the postal vote applications. It's very difficult to do that now. I mean, Australian society is very different.
Within 5 years, membership was 155,000, with more women than men. Yet, like their Conservative forebears, the Liberals recruited from Protestant Australia.
The group representing the UAP, at that time of which I was a member, a check was made of every individual in that group. And on the executive of the
general consensus. And I think that belonging to a totally different social group, basically working class people of largely before the war and Irish antecedents, they simply wouldn't have wanted to be in the same political organisation.
A Catholic was opposed wherever possible. saw that this was not going to lead us anywhere.
Sectarianism was alive and well in the 50s. And I think he fought against that always. And he went to great pains to consult, talk to, and everybody he could. And I think he would like to have had a country where there were no divisions of that sort.
As war ended, there was a second wave of recruits. Labor had gained respect for its wartime stewardship, but many of the services were deeply conservative.
Singapore. What's there on your head? What do you got there on your head? Oh, all the men got out with it. Let's have a look at the nine. Yeah.
When the war was over, we had delays in getting our troops back to Australia. Naturally, they were restless. They wanted to come back. And when I landed at Cairns with a contingent of soldiers that I'd flown in from Moresby, when we came ashore, I remember as well the reaction of the troops that I had with me when on the side of a wall was painted a big sign, the Cairns branch of the Communist Party of Australia. And it sort of said everything. Perhaps we were oversensitive.
Very recently at an Anzac Day, perhaps the first after the war, when there was a huge crowd at the Melbourne Shrine. I mean, there would be over 100,000 marching men and more than that of civilians. And he said, don't you think, you fellas, that you handed in your duty to this country when you handed in your ammunition and your arms and your uniforms? There are still great threats to the way of life we've been defending by arms. You are the natural leaders of this country, and will be for 30, 40 years, and you come out and oppose this in your unions and your school boards and your shire councils and whatever you happen to take an active interest, your RSL, whatever you take an interest in. Now, when we broke up, none of us thought other than that he was referring to the Communist Party.
In 1946, the Liberals faced their first election.
In giving Australia a major place among the nations of the world, J.B. Chipley, here seen with President Truman, and such men as Dr.
Labor leader Curtin had died, but had been replaced by the popular Ben Chifley. It was the Liberals' worst ever result, only 33% of the vote.
I remember after the 1946 election, a reporter rang my father and said, would you like to comment? And he said, what can you say when you've been run over by a steamroller?
It was devastating for the party and for Mr. Menzies. And we began to wonder whether it was possible for us to win an election with Mr. Menzies as leader. Now, that is always the first thing a Liberal thinks of. It's always the leaders to blame. They never consider that it might be the party itself.
In fact, one of my brothers said to me one day, oh, we can't win with Menzies. And I remember saying to him that you didn't change the captain of a cricket team until you found a better one.
In the end, the Liberals did not have to make their own fortunes. In 1947, Prime Minister Chifley gave Menzies the boost he needed.
A crowd of more than 10,000 listened to speakers of the Bank Officers Association protesting against the Chifley government's plan to nationalise banks.
I think everybody voted Labor in 1943. Maybe I wasn't old enough to vote, I was so stupid. But to vote Labor, by the time I got discharged in 1946, I voted Labor again. Then I went to university and Chifley decided to nationalise banks. Well, no bugger was going to tell me where I was going to bank. We thought we'd been fighting for the four freedoms. And we had this bunch of socialist lunatics in Canberra who thought they were going to control every bit of our life. So there was a jack-up.
Rolling strikes in industry after industry were disrupting production throughout the country as we moved into 1949. Worst hit were the coal fields. This subversive and very active policy of the Communist Party was being intensified, centering in New South Wales. Mines were at a standstill, but at mass meetings on the fields, the insidious red propaganda was at peak production, feeding the thousands of unemployed.
An election was due in 1949. The tide ran against a government beset by rationing, the bank issue and the coal strike. The public had not learned to love Menzies, but they didn't need to.
A big swing against the Labour government has taken place. In the state of Queensland, Labour has so far only won 4 seats against...
I remember that 49 election night very well. I came home from the pictures, as we call them, with Mum and Dad and one of my brothers, and my eldest brother was there, and he excitedly said, "We've won, and the biggest swing's been in Queensland." Dad was particularly happy because he owned a garage and it was the end of petrol rationing.
It was jubilant. It was great excitement. I imagine very much like 1972 when Whitlam came in with its time. It was time and it was exciting and it was wonderful.
In conjunction with their country party allies, the Liberals had won a 27-seat majority.
We represent all the people, not just the ones who voted for us, but the ones who voted against us. And that the real thing that we have to produce in Australia is not only national prosperity, but national unity.
Governing for all Australians raised the question of what to do with the legacy of the just opposed Labor government.
The greatest substantial authority that a Prime Minister has is in the creation of policy.
In fact, many post-war initiatives had already been set in place by Labor. Migration, the Snowy Mountains scheme, soldier resettlement. But there was a change of emphasis.
Now, what is the value of this middle class so defined and described? First, it has a stake in the country. It has responsibility for home. Home's material, home's human, home's spiritual.
We believed that home ownership was one of the key differences between the Socialists and the Liberal Party at the 49 election. Deadman, in the Chifley government, said more than once, we don't want to build in Australia a whole mass of little capitalists.
If Labor didn't want little capitalists, the Liberals did. Banks were given tax breaks in return for lending to first home buyers. There were new suburbs, new electorates, new middle-class voters.
There were things about that period that provided people with reassurance and hope. And one of the great success stories of that period was the way in which we enthusiastically absorbed so many migrants from Europe. You meet them now in middle and old age talking very enthusiastically and passionately. I struck them the other night at a Greek ball. They talked about how they were received into Australia and they were given a chance. And they love those years because the contrast was so stark from war-devastated Europe.
You see, under a communist government, you're pushed around. And if you don't like it, that's just too bad.
By 1950, the international Cold War was underway.
Today in Australia, Reds openly preach their gospel, flout our laws, and...
In Australia, Communist Party membership had halved since the war, but communists maintained strong influence in trade unions.
There was very little humour on the wharves. Big Jim Healy, boss of the Waterside Workers' Federation, had banned loading of ships to New Zealand. He was sentenced to 6 weeks' jail and fined on 4 charges of interfering with trade across the Tasman.
There was a feeling of almost of crisis in the community because these communists had really set out to take charge and something had to be done about them except words.
Menzies introduced a bill to outlaw the Communist Party. It aimed at a blacklist of Marxist sympathisers to be banned from any government or union job. It raised an important question. How liberal was the Liberal Party?
We had lots of party meetings about whether or not the Communist Party should be outlawed or declared illegal. And it was a very difficult one, because what were you going to do with people who defied the ban? You can't put people in jail for having certain opinions. You can for expressing them, of course. And that wasn't very nice either.
On June 25th at 4 a.m., the North Korean army crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea, and the battle was on. The free nation...
Menzies would defend the bill as a security measure, saying that the government expected the Korean War to escalate into a global anti-Soviet war within 3 years.
The world needs the United States of America. The world needs the British peoples of the world. The world needs every scrap of democratic strength that can be found in it.
Meanwhile, Labour was hopelessly split by the bill, opposing then supporting it. Liberals could scent the division in Labour ranks.
The Communist Party existence was of great political value to us because, generally speaking, Australians were frightened of them, didn't trust them, and we used their presence and their affiliation with the left wing of the Labour Party to a very great advantage.
Members of the Communist Party from all states protest against the anti-Red Bill, aimed at dissolving the Australian Communist Party. They challenged the act, and after a 23-day hearing before 7 judges of the High Court, the Anti-Red Act was declared to be constitutionally invalid. It was a victory for the Communist Party and Party Chairman Sharkey, who had just...
Days after the High Court decision, Menzies obtained a double dissolution.
As the first returns are posted in the tally room, radio and newspaper correspondents flash figures throughout Australia. The Liberal Country Party has returned to office with the loss of only a few seats.
Hundreds of thousands lined the streets in capital cities to watch the Jubilee procession. New Australians from all over
The election was the year that the Commonwealth celebrated its Jubilee.
displaying enthusiasm for their new country.
The Liberal-controlled Parliament gathered for a festive ball.
Menzies was in charge of proceedings in King's Hall and Parliament House, where there was a glittering crowd for the celebration of the 50th anniversary of Federation.
And Chifley said, "I'm going to be in bed reading a whodunit." He didn't go to the ball.
I was standing outside the entrance to the House of Reps about 9:30 or 10, with all the splendour of this magnificent function on, and Everett put his head around the corner and said, "Fred, I want to see you." Oh, I said, "Don't worry me now, Doc. I'm about to go and have a dance." No, he said, "You've got to come with me. Chifley's dying."
Menzies had to go to the microphone and announce this publicly.
You know, personally,
the last kick of the Labour Party. But that would be the sort of thing that I thought then, yes.
Things were very different in those days. And there was not the same animosity between people on different...
But politically, from the time he came in, I disliked him and distrusted him.
Credentials greater than those of Menzies, but Everett was a poor speaker and debater in Parliament. Menzies was brilliant. Menzies could... Menzies resented Everett's intellectual accomplishments, I think, and Everett resented Menzies'
The only thing I can remember my father saying about, talking about Everett once, was he said, "I wish I'd done a doctorate, and then we could both be doctors."
The first battle between the leaders took place within weeks. Menzies reintroduced the Communist Bill, modified into a referendum. Evatt tirelessly travelled the country, advocating a no vote. But the referendum also caused ructions within the Victorian Liberal Party. Young Liberals campaigned against the measure, led by their Vice President, Alan Misson.
He was, of course, immensely affronted, as I think we all were, by what was going on in America at the time with McCarthyism, which if it hadn't been happening, you couldn't have believed. And the idea that we should follow any such similar pattern, he just thought was totally undemocratic, totally unnecessary and totally absurd.
Alan Misson was a born rebel, and he found it very hard to do the work that he was required to do when he got onto the executive. So much so that in the end I moved for his suspension from the executive. And he was suspended for quite some time.
Alan, throughout his political life, stood for a view of politics and of liberal politics, which in my opinion, and of course I'm biased, but it is my considered opinion, was immensely important to the Liberal Party. It's often referred to as small L liberalism.
I had nothing against Misson personally, but I could see that if he was allowed to go on that way, we'd never get anywhere.
Throughout Alan's career, there were always people who would make remarks like Mr. Anderson, which I think to a degree, I mean, such views were, of course, very sincerely held, but I think all of this is reflecting is two entirely different views of what the party should be like.
Most Liberals supported a yes vote. On the eve of the poll, newspaper magnate Frank Packer personally wrote an advertising banner. But neither Menzies nor Packer had judged the electorate accurately. The referendum narrowly failed its required majority in New South Wales, South Australia and Victoria.
Menzies was bitter about losing the anti-communist referendum. And I remember leaving the Hotel Australia in Sydney and driving with him out to the airport on Sunday morning after the defeat. And I recall him saying to me, "Well, my boy, that's the last referendum I will ever put to the people of Australia."
What was your reaction when you found that you'd lost the referendum, only very narrowly, but that it had been lost?
Well, I did what I always did in my prime ministerial life. I had dinner, I got into bed, and as I told my parson once, I said, "You'll be shocked by this," but when I'd got into bed and had read a book for a while, I used to say to myself, "To hell with them," and put my head on the pillow and go to sleep. Mr. Khrushchev said, among other things,
anti-communism continued as a major theme.
Nations who oppress other nations cannot themselves be free.
It underpinned the Liberal achievement of a post-war defence structure linking Australia with America, New Zealand and Southeast Asia.
To win freedom and independence.
And domestically, it was good politics. Before the 1954 election, the Liberals were trailing when a Red Scare broke again.
In the House of Representatives, the Prime Minister announced that Vladimir Petrov, third Secretary of the Russian Embassy, has approached Australian security men and sought asylum. This had been granted. The news of a spy ring which might involve Australian nationals shocked the nation. Mrs. Petrov, firmly gripped by the two Russians, is partly assisted, partly dragged towards the plane. She is obviously...
I stood under the tail of the plane on the airport.
Mrs. Petrov, up to this point, has not sought asylum in Australia.
And the crowd, some of them were yelling, "Stay, Petrova," and some were yelling, "Go home, Petrova." And they pulled the gangplank away from the plane.
She looks back for one instant as if beseeching help and is then forced further up the gangway.
And as I was there, I looked up and I looked her full in the face and I knew what she was feeling. And I also knew that if she went, the election would have been lost. So I went back and I rang up the lodge. At that stage, the cabinet was having its end of session dinner. I think they were all fairly well primed. I subsequently heard that there was a debate at the dinner table. Some people, particularly McEwen, said, "Do nothing, let her go." Menzies, however, came round to the position that something had to be done. A message was sent to the plane.
Everyone now knows what happened 7 hours later in Darwin. There, Mrs. Petrov sought asylum in Australia, and it was granted. The Russian diplomats went on to Russia.
Mrs. Petrov's rescue helped the Liberals to their third election victory. Its aftermath was to decimate Labour. Petrov alleged members of Evert's staff were Soviet contacts.
He went a bit odd over all that business. Evert really lost his balance over this matter.
Evert turned on anti-communists inside his own party. Some were expelled. A mostly Catholic right wing split off to form the Democratic Labour Party, a gift to the Liberals.
There wasn't much point in starting a party which became the DLP. If you then gave it second preferences to the Labour Party, they would flow back. You might as well not have started. So to be effective, you had to give your second preferences to the Liberals in order to ensure that Labour didn't come to power.
Once again, the DLP's second preferences went to the Liberals, and that virtually...
4 out of 5 DLP preferences, former Labour votes, flowed to the Liberals. The Liberal Party went out of its way to support its new electoral allies.
It had been fighting as hard as ever.
There were occasions where I raised money for them separately. I would go to selected people whom I knew well. I'd explain the situation to them. I would say it was absolutely essential that we had the DLP preferences. If we didn't have them, we couldn't win government or we couldn't retain government. And 9 times out of 10, they would give me an amount, maybe 500, maybe 1,000.
Vote for the lively DLP candidates. And in doing so...
Voting figures suggest that without DLP preferences, the coalition may have lost every election from 1958 to 1975.
Pensioners protest and unemployment figures rise. The politicians are not winning any popularity poll here.
Even with DLP preferences, the Liberals had a scare against Evert's successor, Caldwell, in 1961.
And the credit squeeze starts.
We were devastated here in Queensland. Menzies held up throughout the rest of Australia, but we lost seats galore. On the Saturday night, election night, I was a certain Labor gain. No less an authority than the then Australian Broadcasting Commission had me as down and out, gone and forgotten. I wasn't so sure.
Well, Jim was an ardent anti-communist. There were a number in the Parliament when I first went in, but when the election of 1961 came along and the result dragged on for about 10 days, it all hinged on Jim Killen's seat, and in the end he won by Communist Party preferences, only by 100 or so votes. But for some strange reason, we never heard Jim make another anti-communist speech after that.
Liberals reacted quickly to their near miss. Their main priority was to regain business confidence.
I want the Tariff Board to bear in mind in the first place that it is an advisory authority, it's not a policy-making instrument of government.
Country Party Trade Minister John McEwen was allowed to give special trade protection to manufacturing, a policy which would outlast Menzies and continue right through the 1960s.
One of the serious consequences of Sir Robert Menzies' neglect, if you like, or failure to cultivate big business was that Sir John McEwen and the Country Party had gained enormous influence with big business and were sometimes successful in pressuring the government in directions, particularly with regard to tariffs, which might not necessarily have been in Australia's good as a whole.
I can remember in Cabinet that the Tariff Board report brought down giving an unanswerable case that a certain industry in a country town should be closed down, woolen industry. It was costing Australian consumers a fortune to keep this alive. The member of Parliament for that area, that happened to be the Deputy Prime Minister, John McEwen, said, "This is not going to go through. This report is not going to be accepted because it will cost me dearly electorally in Wangaratta." And we're talking about the Wangaratta woolen mills and Bruck mills. And he won without a fight. That's political realism, I suppose, but very bad government.
Any city like Sydney is a hub of commerce as well as a congregation of homes.
In response to business pressure, Menzies also set up a committee to investigate the economy.
Any big store is a clearinghouse for the varied wonders of every land. Italian textiles, Eastern silks and Australian wool.
The Byrne Committee sat for 2 years and produced the most
But Miladi's whims mean jobs for designers, tanners and sales.
His main objection to the Verne report were proposals relating to target rates of growth, target migration numbers, to the establishment of an advisory body which would look at the medium and long-term aspects of economic policy. I think politicians live from one election to another, and getting hooked into policies which are too long-term, certainly on the economic side, makes life difficult for them. And Menzies was not given to long-term views on economic matters.
Whatever his economic record, Robert Menzies continued to dominate political combat.
I talk about the Air Force, and I talk about it with very great pleasure because there's some fellow who said you haven't got one, you see? Now, what is the position? What is the position? My dear boy, you're not off the drawing board yourself. Why, not even a prototype yet, this chap.
I used to go on campaigns with my father all the time. We always had the feeling that he was a little tense until the first person yelled out, "Give us your policy, pig iron." And then he relaxed and he got into the swing of it and he could answer the interjectors, and it was a lot of fun.
The early election Menzies called in 1963 was a triumph. A 1-seat margin converted into a 22-seat landslide. Menzies entered his last period in office unchallenged.
Menzies was the party. He towered over it. He had very high standards and requirements. He didn't tell you when you weren't meeting them, or if you weren't meeting them, but you became aware of it. As I've said before, he was an aloof man. I don't think myself that people who achieve great political office are very easy to work for ever.
Menzies taught me a great deal. He was an exemplary parliamentary performer, but I also liked observing the way his mind was going to work. If he was going to make an important speech, I'd try and work out in my own mind, what's he going to be saying, what lines he going to take, and I suppose I'd give myself marks whether I got quite close or not.
I've got Menzies, in my estimation, in a pretty hallowed place, because I liked the man. I lost my father the year I got into Parliament, and Menzies became the father figure and used to treat me as a son, strangely enough. So I've got that sort of respect. But I think history will judge the Menzies era in politics very harshly, because I think that what the opportunities that Menzies had and the Liberal Party had in those days could read much, much better if he had have taken a few risks.
We have established most normal relations with Japan.
Throughout his term, there had been initiatives which bore Menzies' stamp.
There are some who will never be able to blot it out of their memory, but as a nation, we should blot out of our minds and hearts hostilities of the past.
A trade treaty with Japan in 1957 would make Japan our largest trading partner and lay the basis of the economic future. He'd set in place the creation of 8 new Australian universities. He'd dedicated himself to the development of the national capital.
Some commentators claim that the Prime Minister has made a hobby of the development of Canberra.
And the health and the future of these sturdy young Australians is one of the greatest concerns of the men who govern the nation today.
The criticism that he didn't do enough for the future is, of course, the recollection with hindsight.
As the young country grows, theirs is the task ahead.
He, after all, delivered prosperity. He did create a situation when I left school with the leaving certificate in 1956. There were 2% unemployed and the interest rate was 5% and I had no trouble getting a job.
Sir Robert Menzies paid tribute to the work of the nuns and stressed the importance of Christian education.
By the 1960s, some of the tribalism of Australian politics began to break down. The DLP was demanding a return for those crucial preferences.
Equipment can be found.
Liberals finally agreed to give state aid to private, mostly Catholic schools.
Come on, count with me. 1, 2.
The party born of Protestant Australia eased the financial burden on many Catholic families.
Ursuline nuns, Sisters of St. Joseph and Sisters of Mercy study the teacher's method.
However, on most issues, the party and Menzies were as bound to old loyalties as ever.
There are clever people in the world, at least so I understand, who have discovered that all sorts of things ought to be done to the monarchy, to democratize the monarchy, to do something to it, to do something to what we all are proud to say is the most democratic monarchy in the whole wide world.
After Winston Churchill's death in 1965, the Prime Minister accepted the honorary British title of Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports.
This is a purely local matter of great historic interest and continuity, and it happens now for the first time to go to a man outside Great Britain.
They are a reminder of the ancient liberties and privileges. And Sir Robert is a very popular choice in Dover.
We all trooped down to Menzies' office. He was very keen to tell us about the whole detail of the history of the Cinque Ports, and we even got round to discussing whether he'd have a uniform made, and yes, he would have a uniform made, he said, and would he live there? Well, he might get an apartment set up there, and perhaps he would go over there from time to time. And at the time, there was a national maritime strike. All the waterfront was closed down, and as the press conference was coming to an end, Ian Fitchett, one of the great characters of the gallery, finally said, "Well, sir," he said, we've heard about your ports. Now, can you tell us about our ports?" To which Menzies said, "Go and see the Minister for Shipping."
Robert Menzies retired in 1966, the nation's longest-serving Prime Minister.
One becomes tired, one becomes not quite 100%. And I have an old-fashioned belief that the Prime Minister of this country ought to be 100% efficient at all times. It's not an ordinary decision. This is something that doesn't happen very frequently, for a man to go out of office under his own steam. I've gone out of office before today under somebody else's steam, but this time under my own.
The Liberals could look back upon 17 years of stable government. In all that time, not a whisper of corruption.
People ought to remember today, Menzies left the Parliament of Australia after many, many years of great endeavour and great success
a poor man, having gone into Parliament rather a wealthy man. He made considerable sacrifices of capital and income to be in the Parliament.
My father was really very stingy with public money. I can remember some friends coming to stay in Canberra when my parents were there. So my mother took her car out of the garage so they could use it. And Lee said to my father, "Bob, really, I do think it's time you had another garage at the lodge." And he said, "Lee, I'm the last of the amateurs." And I think he probably was.
On his retirement, the Sydney Morning Herald said,
"He has never fallen below the highest standards expected of a Prime Minister."
But it also said,
"It was not an era of political or intellectual excitement. Ideas were not welcomed. Debate was not encouraged. Intellectuals were frowned upon or snubbed. It is time for a change."
He was an old man then, and just in the way of things, he didn't see people in the Liberal Party very much. There were people who really were friends who went to see him. I can remember Alec Downer saying, "We should all go and sit at the feet of Gamaliel and receive his wisdom and ask his advice." Well, they didn't do that.
Robert Gordon Menzies withdrew from public life and soon after had a stroke, making it difficult for him to go out. He was occasionally seen indulging his passion for the Carlton Football Club. One of his few confidants was not a Liberal at all, but fellow Carlton supporter Bob Santamaria.
Every 3 weeks or so, when you would call around to the Menzies home in Haverbrack Avenue, it would be about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. At about 5:45, you'd have a drink together. And one day, right out of the blue, he said to me, he said, "Well, young Bob," and I was nearly 60 years of age, "tell me the 3 biggest mistakes I ever made." But of course I had never thought of any mistakes that he'd made, and I certainly didn't want to begin then in his own home. I said that I had never given any thought to the question. He said, "Well, nevertheless, think now." And I said, "Look, I can't extemporise." "No," he said, "I want you to think." So I said, "Well, at your insistence," because it was rude, I said, "the first mistake, I think, is that you really are responsible for consolidating Canberra as the national capital. And you've created in Australia an oligarchy that we can never get at. Doesn't matter what they do to the country, we can't do anything to them." He nodded his head. Then I said, "You accepted the Martin report and helped to create altogether, I think that there were 17 universities in Australia. And I said, it should have been obvious that there weren't enough good academics in Australia to run 7, let alone 17. And this was at the period, of course, of all the Vietnam troubles. And he nodded his head. And then he said, "And what's the third mistake?" And I said, "Well, you created the Liberal Party." And he said, "But they're the only 3 things I ever did."
My father said to me, "When I retire, all the clever people will say, nothing ever happened in Menzies' time. He was no good, forget about him." But he said, "Don't fret about it too much, because eventually it should come right."
All right, that should be enough. You've got enough fuel.
Can we get something to show victory?
We're not going to repeat the policies of Menzies because we live in a different era. But a lot of his style, a lot of his attitudes are timeless.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, on Saturday we're all going to vote.
Well, I don't know about taking advice from any particular individual in that way, but...
After Saturday, you will have either one government or another. You will have the Menzies government that you've become perhaps a little accustomed to.
All of us in the Liberal Party have been through difficult times recently. Today, we have put all of that behind us.
You know us, you know me, for better or for worse. You know our policies in practice, and you know
There's
the
no
results.
point in reflecting on that. We'll leave the past to historians. Peter and I, we're interested in the future. We're not historians.
You know what to do. Anyhow, whatever you do will be right. I hope it will keep your present government at the head of your administration in this wonderful country of Australia. Thank you, and good night, ladies and gentlemen, and good luck to all of you.
That's why I feel angry at the unspeakable bastards who are plotting his defeat.
It will be all the way to Melbourne.
The Liberal Party, perhaps, has never quite recovered from those events.
Bill knew that that was a disaster as far as the election was concerned.
The gods had been thrown out of heaven. And here they were.
The Liberals, 8:30 next Wednesday. A helpless man is brutally bashed.
Mr. Provost, I'm Tina Bertram. I'm prosecuting your case.
And Tina finds she's on a case.
The man's a Darrow?
The Darrow mate wound up at St. Bees on life support. That is not only frustrating,
Mr. Provost, who hit you?
but also moving.
Are they in this courtroom?
Superb Australian drama.
They nearly killed him. Stop it, we're not backing out now.
Janus, 8:30 Thursday, ABC.
Coming up on the 7:30 report, pay TV. Will we ever see it, and who are the winners?
In Australia, we are letting Optus and Telecom go in there with absolutely no fee.
That's coming up.
Hello again from Ian Henderson. Iraq has angrily criticised the UN for not lifting economic sanctions as its troops withdraw from the Kuwaiti frontier. Washington has reportedly told Baghdad to move its troops above the 32nd parallel to create a demilitarised buffer zone. A political crisis in Russia tonight after an overnight plunge in the value of the ruble. It was the biggest fall on record, fuelling rampant inflation. It steadied a little today, but not enough to stave off a no-confidence vote in Russia's government. Back home, talks to avert Friday's public transport strike will continue tomorrow, while at Bundoora, 1,000 staff at Victoria's biggest psychiatric centre will walk off the job in protest against government cutbacks. And in racing, Paris Lane has firmed as favourite for Saturday's Caulfield Cup after drawing an inside position at today's barrier draw. Melbourne tomorrow, fine with a top of 19 degrees. Good night.
For 11 years, the Federal Liberal Party's answer to electoral failure has been to trade in its leaders. Now, as the party approaches its 50th birthday, a new book challenges the Messiah complex and the whole structure of the party. The Critic and the Party President on Lateline, 10:30 tonight.
An epic drama of faith and fanaticism. Archbishop Hoyland, blinded by ambition, and Martha, his wife.
I'm angry. Angry that you just dragged me through all that for the sake of your career.
Gil, an Israeli soldier in Jerusalem. And Yosef, a Palestinian by birth, obsessed by a desire to trace his Muslim roots. 3 families, Muslim, Christian and Jewish. Their destinies were to become dramatically entwined. A special premiere of The Big Battalions, 8:30 Sunday.
Eric Rosen is an American citizen.
He lives in a quiet suburb on Long Island, New York. Eric was born in Munich. 50 years ago, fleeing the Nazis in Germany, Eric's mother brought him to Italy and then France, which was the beginning of the Holocaust in France. Eric was 14 years old. He was arrested in the street near Nice railway station and taken to Gestapo headquarters.
I was carrying false identity cards for other people. A German came out and he arrested me. I immediately told him that my name is, I had a French name. I did not give my Jewish name, but it didn't help. What they did is
for Paris. He was brought to Drancy, a concentration camp 7 kilometers from the center of Paris. Modernism. It was the first development of design in Paris. Construction started in the late 90s. But in 1941, with building works unfinished, Drancy was turned into a concentration camp for Jews. Drancy was not the only concentration camp in France. In the 1930s, the French built a network of camps to hold refugees from the Spanish Civil War and Jews escaping the Nazis. The camps were run by the French gendarmerie, or military police. The majority of in the 1930s, the Jews living in France were divided into groups. Most lived working-class Jewish neighborhoods like the 11th arrondissement. Barak Adler, the son of immigrants, was keenly aware of the differences between the Israelites and the immigrant Jews.
We are two worlds coexisting, unhappily coexisting. On the one hand, you have the old established Jewish conservative forces represented by the
felt safe. They felt
On est une famille assez attirée.
du passage de la rue de la Roquette où nous habitions. Et il adorait tout son entourage français. Et tout allait bien pour nous. C'était une vie formidable avant l'arrivée des Allemands. In May 1940, Hitler's panzer divisions advanced through northern France. On June 14th, Paris fell to the Germans. France capitulated. 1 week later, the French agreed terms with the Nazis. France was divided in two. The Germans occupied the north and created a so-called free zone in the south. There, the collaborationist Vichy regime would have its seat. In an attempt to restore national pride, French war hero Maréchal Philippe Pétain was made head of state. Pierre Laval, a former socialist, became prime minister. Wanting to be the second power in Hitler's new Europe, Vichy exploited the anti-Semitic feeling which already existed in France. They encouraged a campaign of propaganda against the Jews. Without prompting from Germany, Vichy introduced anti-Semitic measures. Jews were forced to register with the police. Then, in October 1940, Vichy enacted a Statut des Juifs, a law which stripped Jews of their rights. When the law was published, one of the most prominent lawyers in France today, Maître Yves Jouffat, was 20 years old. He had just been demobilized from the French army.
Ça a été pour moi un événement extraordinaire, terrible, aussi grave que la défaite et l'armistice. Je suis allé trouver immédiatement mes chefs de camp. Et je leur ai dit, je ne suis plus un citoyen. Je vous demande en conséquence de me dispenser de tous les services que je faisais jusqu'à maintenant, le matin, le salut au drapeau, les corvées, etc. Et ces deux hommes, que je voudrais bien retrouver maintenant, ont hésité 2-3 secondes, se sont regardés et ils m'ont dit « Nous vous comprenons, nous sommes d'accord ».
On August the 20th, 1941, French police surrounded the 11th arrondissement of Paris. The 11th was a center of the emerging Jewish resistance against the German occupying forces. Led by young communists, the resistance organized demonstrations and printed anti-Nazi leaflets. Partly in retaliation, the Germans instructed the French to arrest Jewish men in that area. 2,400 police and gendarmes carried out the operation.
J'ai vu deux flics, deux agents de police en uniforme et un en civil. Et ils venaient arrêter M. Israël Radzinski, c'était mon père. Et ma mère était incapable de prononcer une parole. Ça faisait à peine un an, pas tout à fait un an que son mari était mort. Elle était incapable de prononcer une parole, elle était paralysée pratiquement.
The police arrested Sam instead of his late father.
Mon père m'appelle. Yves, descend, on vient nous chercher. Et il y avait là 2 policiers, de ceux qu'on appelle vulgairement les flics, un gardien de la paix et un brigadier. J'ai dit à ce moment-là, je vous rappelle que j'étais sous l'uniforme français il y a quelques mois. Ce n'est pas très beau ce que vous êtes en train de faire. J'ai mieux être à ma place qu'à la vôtre.
More than 4,000 Jewish men were taken. The French police carried out the entire operation, from the actual arrests to the processing of the paperwork. They herded the Jews onto buses, which had been commandeered from the Paris public transport system. Under the watchful eye of the SS, French bus drivers took the prisoners to the concentration camp at Drancy.
Et j'ai été amené à Drancy le 20 août 41. Il devait être 8 ou 10 heures du matin. Je ne peux, entre 8 et 10 heures du matin, je ne peux pas vous préciser l'heure parce que j'avais pas eu le temps d'emmener ma montre. Hein. Et j'ai donc fait avec 5000 autres personnes, j'ai fait l'ouverture du camp de Drancy.
Nous pensions qu'on allait nous libérer après une vérification. C'était de la folie, mais on n'avait pas encore arrêté de français. Moi, je venais d'être démobilisé quelques mois auparavant. Stupidement, on a cru qu'on allait nous libérer.
Si on n'avait pas vu qu'il y avait déjà des barbelés, on aurait pu croire qu'on arrive dans un groupe d'immeubles plutôt modernes d'aspect extérieur, puisque la construction avait commencé, mais elle n'était pas terminée. Il y avait par exemple pas d'installation d'eau, pas d'installation sanitaire, à peine des installations électriques et encore pas partout. Donc, une fois arrivé dans le camp, on a été répartis, on a été mis dans des chambrées. Des chambrées, c'était des grandes pièces où on n'avait pas encore fait les cloisons, où on était 50 par pièce.
Nous étions sur des chalits qui vont très vite être pleins de punaises, d'ailleurs, on se battra avec les punaises. Sur ces chalits, pas de matelas, pas même de la paille. On dormait à même les lattes de bois. Et le régime va être très vite assez dur.
Il y a des gens qui probablement s'étaient jamais déshabillés devant leurs enfants. Qu'on a été 50 dans une chambre, on était tous pratiquement, on ne se connaissait pas. Être obligé de se déshabiller devant les autres, c'était déjà se sentir rabaisser un être inférieur.
From August 1941 to July 1943, Drancy was run entirely by the French. Inside the camp, gendarmes were responsible for discipline. Armed with machine guns, they also manned the guard towers and patrolled the barbed wire fence.
Il y avait 2 brigades de gendarmes. Et l'avait-on fait exprès? L'une de ces brigades était très répressive, antisémite, odieuse. L'autre était très correcte et plutôt compatissante. Je me souviens d'un autre, un officier de gendarmerie, qui nous obligeait à longer les murs. Et à un certain endroit, il y avait une vingtaine de robinets d'eau. Ces robinets étaient reliés au mur par un tube qui était peut-être à 50 cm du sol. Quand on passait, comme il fallait longer le mur, on était obligé de ramper sous le tube pour passer là.
The prisoners were made to run the internal administration of the camp themselves. The building was designed around 22 staircases. Inmates were forced to elect a head of staircase. During the first months of Drancy, their job was to hand out the meager bread allowance. Class divisions between the immigrants and Israelites were exploited. The immigrants were assigned menial chores, while the Israelites had more comfortable jobs and ran the administration.
The Nazis tested the system in Germany, where they'd compelled all the Jewish organizations to centralize themselves and be represented by one central leadership. The same principle was applied in the camp. You got the Jews to run the internal administration under supervision. In the case of Drancy, it was under French supervision, which itself was supervised by the Nazis.
Leur principe, c'était de faire le travail de gestion, d'administration à l'intérieur du camp ou des prisons par les prisonniers eux-mêmes. Donc, ils recrutaient déjà parmi ce qu'ils appelaient les proéminentes, les gens déjà qui parlaient, tout le monde parlait français, mais ceux qui avaient à leurs yeux plus de qualité que d'autres, qui savaient écrire par exemple. Alors, il s'est formé une caste, ceux qui travaillaient dans les bureaux, ceux qui travaillaient à la cuisine, hein, ceux qui avaient n'importe quel petit emploi, n'importe quelle petite fonction. Ça signifiait aussi une différenciation dans le régime.
There was a critical shortage of food. By September, men were starving.
Au bout de quelques semaines, est apparu des hommes qui, après avoir terriblement maigri, gonflaient, étaient atteints d'une sorte d'œdème. Très grave, parce que quand un homme commençait à gonfler, c'est un signe, et il y a eu, à cette période, quelques dizaines de morts de famine. Sur leur fiche, on inscrivait mort de misère physiologique. Misère physiologique.
The only toilet facility for the 5,000 men in Drancy was a latrine at one end of the courtyard.
Derrière cette baraque des latrines, des toilettes, en France on dit des chiottes, hein, on mettait les ordures du camp. Et ça, là, j'ai vu des choses que je ne pourrais jamais oublier. Ça, j'aurais pu le faire, je ne l'ai pas fait, mais constater, ça n'est pas condamné. J'ai vu des hommes, ça aurait pu être mon père, ça aurait pu être moi aussi, mais pour moi qui avais 18 ans, j'ai vu des hommes se précipiter sur les ordures. Et les ordures d'un camp de concentration, les ordures, c'est déjà... C'est épouvantable, mais les ordures d'un camp ou d'une prison, c'est inimaginable. Alors j'ai vu des gens, ils attendaient et ils se précipitaient pour trouver à manger. Hein? Alors bon, je ne l'ai pas fait. Je suis ému parce que quand je parle de ça, je pense aussi à ce qui s'est passé après.
Drancy concentration camp was in the center of a community of 35,000 people. Nearby residents could see inside. They could see the gendarmes in their guard towers, machine guns at the ready. Customers at a cafe across the street could see directly into the camp. A gendarme ran a black market, accepting bribes to take a food parcel inside, even, if the price was right, to secure an inmate's release. People living in high-rise apartment buildings overlooked the camp. René Amboulas was 9 years old when the first Jews were brought to Drancy.
La pensée des Dranciens libres et des internés, on ne pouvait pas la comprendre parce qu'on ne les connaissait pas, on ne pouvait pas leur parler, on ne pouvait pas s'arrêter. Et en plus, les gens avaient peur d'en parler, chacun avait peur de son voisin. Tout le monde avait peur d'être dénoncé pour la moindre chose, et ça a été vraiment le fait primordial qui a fait que les gens n'en parlaient pas. Parce que chacun avait peur d'être dénoncé, on ne savait pas pourquoi ces gens étaient là, et chacun avait peur d'être dénoncé pour une raison quelconque et d'aller les rejoindre. C'est ça qui dominait finalement. C'était pas une indifférence, humaine, c'était la peur. On avait peur.
By November 1941, Conditions inside the French-run camp had become so appalling that the German authorities felt forced to act.
Je pense qu'à ce moment-là, les Allemands ont eu peur. Peur de quoi? Qu'il y ait à l'intérieur du camp le choléra ou une épidémie, que cette épidémie soit transmise aux gendarmes qui nous gardaient, lesquels la transmettraient à l'extérieur. Et n'oubliez pas que nous étions aux portes de Paris, éventuellement à l'armée d'occupation.
That November, inmates who were seriously ill, along with those under 18 and over 70, were released. The Nazis worked out the details of the final solution at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. In France, a broad range of repressive measures were taken against the Jews. They were forced to wear the yellow star. Anti-Semitic propaganda prepared French public opinion for total expulsion of the Jews from France. Then, in March 1942, a convoy of 1,112 Jews was taken from the camp at Compiègne and brought to Drancy. From Drancy, they were sent east. Between March and July, a further 4,000 Jews were deported from France. In April, René Bousquet was appointed chief of the Police Nationale by Vichy Prime Minister Pierre Laval. The French police had already filed the names and addresses of Jews in Paris. Under Bousquet's supervision, the police prepared for a massive roundup designed to rid Paris of all Jews. In order to control the Jews more effectively, the Nazis had required the French to form a central Jewish organization. It was called the Union Générale des Israélites de France, UGIF for short.
On the 2nd of July 1942, the head of that central Jewish representation in Paris was informed by this Commissioner for Jewish Affairs that you must expect very shortly to deal with the need to equip 7,000 people that would be sent east. On the 2nd of July, the leadership of that central organization, made up of French Israelite, because as a French institution, organized by the French government, it had to be led by French citizens. That institution was aware that a vast measure of internment was in preparation.
Though the directors of UGIF knew that a massive roundup was planned, they did not warn their fellow Jews.
Mon père avait un client qui était un inspecteur de police, un très brave homme qui aimait beaucoup mon père. Il est venu 2 ou 3 jours avant et il a dit à ma mère, faites attention, on a des listes, on va arrêter tous les juifs. Ma mère m'a dit, tu vas dans tout le quartier, tu vas chez tes amis, tu préviens tous tes amis qu'on va arrêter les juifs. Alors je suis partie partout, chez mes camarades de classe, mes petites amies et tout. Et partout où j'allais, les gens ils ne voulaient croire. Et en plus, où ils auraient pu aller? Ils n'avaient pas d'argent. Ils n'avaient pas d'argent. Ils avaient les étoiles. Ils étaient inscrits comme juifs.
Inside Drancy, preparations were made for the roundup.
On nous a fait vider un certain nombre d'escaliers. Et nous avons compris qu'il allait donc y avoir des rafles. Et d'ailleurs, il y a eu des indiscrétions de la part de certains policiers ou de certains gendarmes.
On the 16th and 17th of July 1942, more than 3,000 French police arrested 13,000 Jews in a city-wide roundup. This time, women and children were included. Terror spread through Jewish neighborhoods. Some women threw themselves and their children from windows. 100 suicides were reported during the Grand Rafle, the big roundup. The 13,000 were brought to the Vélodrome d'Hiver, a popular cycling arena. The Vel d'Hiv was opposite the Bir Hakim Bridge and metro station, a busy part of Paris. From the Vel d'Hiv, the Jews were taken to 3 concentration camps, Pithiviers, Beaune-la-Rolande and Drancy.
J'ai vu de mes yeux des femmes séparées de leurs enfants par des soldats allemands à coups de baïonnette. Tellement que un certain nombre d'entre elles sont devenues folles. On les a mis dans ce qu'on appelait le bloc 3. On les entendait hurler la nuit. Et une dizaine ou une douzaine d'entre elles se sont suicidées tant sur l'espèce de toit en béton qu'il y a tout autour du camp, une espèce de préau.
Among these 13,000 Jews arrested were 4,000 kids, 4,000 children under the age of 12. Around their neck were placed a bit of string with a bit of cardboard, and the name of the child was written down on that cardboard. Kids being as they are, they would swap these tickets with their names on. They would throw them away. No one knew the name of these children, and they were kept for 3 or 4 weeks in Beaune-la-Rolande. Kids unable to look after themselves, unable to eat the cabbage on which they were fed daily. Kids being sick with diarrhea within a few days. And then the problem for Danneke, in charge of Jewish affairs, was what does he do with these children? Berlin had given order to send men and women of working age. Danneke sends a telex to Berlin, to Eichmann. What do I do with the children? It takes Berlin 2 weeks to reply, send the children as well.
On the French side, the decision to deport the children was taken by Prime Minister Pierre Laval.
The French gendarmes that had to load the kids in Beaune-la-Rolande onto buses to take them to the railway station were seen to use truncheons on kids, kicking the kids along to get them to move on quickly onto the trucks and buses.
The children were taken to Drancy to join the thousands of men and women already there. Most would remain there only 2 or 3 weeks before being deported. During this period, Jews were deported at the rate of 4,000 per week. They were told they were going to work camps. In 1942, Roger Chandelot was a head of staircase in Drancy, a job that now meant more than just handing out the bread.
Peu de temps après mon arrivée, j'ai pu avoir un petit emploi qui était adjoint chef d'escalier. Ce travail consistait surtout à m'occuper de la distribution du pain, de la soupe, etc., et des appels, et éventuellement aider les gens si on pouvait les aider. Mais on disposait d'ailleurs de très peu de moyens d'aider. Un peu plus tard, c'est-à-dire quelques mois après, j'étais chef d'escalier. C'était à peu près la même chose, à la différence que j'étais mis à m'occuper d'escaliers, de ce qu'on appelait l'escalier de départ.
By August 1942, deportations from Drancy increased to 3 convoys per week.
À un départ, les gens étaient désignés, passaient à la fouille, étaient mis dans ces escaliers à raison de environ 70 par chambre. Les chambres, c'était une grande pièce où il y avait un peu de paille, et c'est tout. Le lendemain, ils étaient déportés.
Les chefs d'escalier, ils les mettaient dans l'obligation, eux, de prendre des responsabilités, c'est-à-dire de remplir les listes de ceux qui allaient partir. Alors qu'est-ce qu'on peut dire, hein? Bien sûr qu'ils auraient pu refuser. Ils auraient pu refuser, ils auraient été déportés eux-mêmes. Mais n'importe comment, la quasi-totalité de ceux qu'on fait les listes ont été aussi déportés.
Donc, réveil vers 5 heures du matin, café, réunion, etc. À 6 heures, il n'y avait plus personne. On enlevait la paille des fois, pas toujours, et on peut dire que dans la matinée, il arrivait de nouveaux internés qui allaient partir 2 jours après.
Il y a des autobus qui sont là, le compteur tourne, on nous jette là-dedans, on nous empile, et on fait un très court voyage, très court, parce que de Nancy à la gare de Bobigny, c'est pas loin, et on arrive sur des quais, c'est désert, c'est la nuit, il y a des projecteurs et des wagons à bestiaux. On remplit, on tasse les gens dans ces wagons. Et quand on est bien tassé, les Allemands ferment la porte, verrouillent, et on part pour Pichipoy. Pichipoy, c'était le nom qu'on donnait, c'est un nom polonais, je crois. Et à Nancy, on disait, on part à Pichipoy, c'est-à-dire au-delà, quelque part. Et le quelque part n'était pas connu, heureusement, malheureusement, mais on allait à Pichipoy.
On ne comprenait pas, on ne savait pas où ils allaient. Certainement, d'autres personnes le savaient, bien entendu, mais le commun des mortels des environs ne le savait pas. On savait qu'ils allaient à la gare de Bobigny, en majorité, mais on ne savait pas dans quelle direction on les envoyait.
On ne savait pas ce que c'était, où allait-on. On avait trouvé un mot, Pichipoy. Voilà, on va à Pichipoy. Quoi faire, on ne savait pas. Beaucoup partaient avec l'espoir de vivre, parce qu'on disait, on va nous faire travailler certainement dur, mais pour qu'on travaille dur, il faut qu'on nous nourrisse. Ça nous paraissait logique. On ne réfléchissait pas à ce qu'on voyait, on aurait dû réfléchir un tout petit peu plus quand même.
Most of the convoys left from Le Bourget-Drancy station. The trains were operated by French drivers as far as the German border. The station is located in a little square opposite a busy cafe. The cafe was popular with men who worked for SNCF, the state railway company. These workers witnessed the deportations from Drancy.
Nous avons été interpellés par l'arrivée d'autobus qui venaient du camp de Drancy et qui se dirigeaient, qui étaient dans la cour en bas de la gare du Bourget Grande Ceinture. Et cet autobus-là était convoyé par des personnels de l'RATP et accompagné par des gardes mobiles du camp de Drancy, avec dans chaque autobus un officier allemand ou un allemand qui avec mitrailleuse. Il y avait des femmes et des enfants, des hommes, je pense, je m'en rappelais que c'était des hommes déjà à un certain âge, il ne devait pas avoir des hommes jeunes. Mais il y avait des enfants, ce qui m'était resté, c'est que les gardes mobiles ont demandé s'il y avait des enfants de moins de 3 ans, ou quelque chose, ça peut être 2 ans ou 4 ans, je ne me rappelle plus, pour leur donner des boîtes de lait condensé, avant de les emmener dans les wagons.
Je dois dire que c'est à cette époque que nous avons vraiment compris quel était le sort des Juifs internés puis déportés. Jusque-là, on pouvait douter, car au fond, les déportés étaient surtout des hommes jeunes et très bien portants. Et donc la fiction du travail dans des camps de travail pouvait apparaître comme plausible. Mais lorsqu'on a vu partir des trains entiers d'enfants, malades, pouilleux, fiévreux, tout petits, un grand frère de 6 ans qui traînait sa sœur de 4 ans et son petit frère de 2 ans, des vieillards, des gens qu'on emmenait sur des civières, des malades, des tuberculeux, ces femmes folles dont je vous parlais, alors on a compris que c'était pour la destruction. Il n'y avait pas d'autre explication.
By mid-November 1942, the French had deported 42,000 Jews. Then, for 3 months, deportations from Drancy stopped. The German army was under pressure on the Russian front. More trains were needed for the war effort. In July 1943, the Germans decided to speed up deportations of the Jews from France. They appointed a German to run Drancy, SS Hauptsturmführer Alois Brunner. Brunner had already supervised the deportation of Jews from Berlin, Austria, and Salonika.
Lorsque les Allemands sont arrivés, là, il fallait faire très attention de ne pas trop les fréquenter. Parce qu'il n'y avait que 3 Allemands dans le camp, mais on les craignait quand même. Ils n'hésitaient pas à tirer 1 ou 2 coups de revolver en l'air. Et on ne sait pas comment ils auraient pu diriger le revolver après, n'est-ce pas? Ils aimaient bien qu'il y ait de l'espace autour d'eux. Ils n'aimaient pas être serrés par les... Autant on ne voulait pas les fréquenter, autant ils ne voulaient pas nous fréquenter. Il y avait des interrogatoires aussi par Brunner qui se faisaient présenter les papiers pour savoir pourquoi un tel ou un tel n'était pas déporté.
Eva Fagelson's false papers allowed her to pass as a Christian, but Brunner was suspicious and interrogated her repeatedly.
Toujours cette peur atroce qu'on me batte, qu'on m'assassine. J'avais même vu tirer sur un jeune dans les jambes qui était arrivé de la prison de Fresnes et qu'on avait mis dans la cave. Il y avait une prison à Drancy, c'était la cave. Et on mettait beaucoup de jeunes. Je disais, moi aussi, on va me mettre dans cette cave. J'avais toujours très peur. Brunner était toujours assis derrière son grand bureau, qui vous fixait avec des yeux d'un bleu d'acier. Il posait toujours les mêmes questions. Où étiez-vous baptisé? Bruckler se tournait tout autour, toujours avec son air de bœuf. Et de temps en temps, il donnait un bon coup. Quand on répondait pas assez vite, quand on répondait pas ce qui lui plaisait. Et la 3e personne faisait l'interprète. Mais l'interprète était juif, lui, il était juste interprète.
After 1943, most Jews in Paris had either been arrested, deported, or gone into hiding. Brunner now decided to take them from the non-occupied zone. He traveled to Nice and began a new phase of roundups.
I was taken downstairs, and I vividly remember a very long table. 3 gentlemen sat there, and the one in the middle interrogated me. He asked me my name, where I was born, and he did not want to believe me, and he hit me on the side of the face. And then he made one remark. He said that Jews, blacks, and dogs belong under the table.
Eric arrived in Drancy in November 1943. He stayed for 3 weeks.
I was walking in the courtyard, just taking a walk. All of a sudden, I saw an SS officer. I recognized his face. His name was Brunner. I stopped and I said hello to him. I was 15 years old. I didn't know what that was, how evil those people were. He was very docile, very polite. He looked at me, gave me a smile, and walked on. Drancy was a camp of deception. We thought we were going to stay there for the duration. For how long, I had no idea. I had no idea that one day we were going to be shipped out.
Graffiti in Drancy shows that even in mid-1944, most inmates did not know their ultimate destination. Many wrote that they were leaving in good spirits. Like the other 74,000 deportees from France, Liliane Lévy-Osbert discovered that Pichipoy, the unknown destination, was Auschwitz death camp. 43,000 French deportees were gassed immediately on arrival. Liliane was selected for work.
Alors là, on commence. On vous inscrit le numéro, là. Moi, j'ai un 74 855. On ne peut pas l'oublier, il est là. Et au moment où la fille, l'internée, la déportée, vous raconte ça, il dit, tu vois, les flammes là-haut, là, tu vois, et alors on voit une grande cheminée avec des flammes. C'est les gens de ton convoi qui brûlent. Alors là, on ne comprend pas. Mais oui, tu vois, vous êtes sortis du train, vous êtes rentrés, et les autres sont directement partis d'une chambre à gaz. Et là, ils brûlent déjà. Alors.
Eric Rosen was deported to Auschwitz. He too was selected for work and sent to a satellite camp, where he labored in a coal mine owned by the German company IG Farben.
I was given a shovel to shovel coal. At the age of 15, that shovel was heavier than me. By the time I got the shovel halfway into the railroad car, I lost half of the coal. When the guards saw that, they stopped beating me up. And that was going on for maybe for a few days until one day I just said, I'm not going to do it anymore. When I went to the bathroom to wash up, I saw a faucet. I took a string that was holding my pants, and I took one end of the string, put it around my neck, and the other half on the faucet, and let myself go. And I didn't succeed to commit suicide. It didn't work because somebody caught me, and they called the guards, and they unleashed the string, which was already tied around my neck, and the guards beat me up. And they punished me because I was sabotaging the war effort.
Brunner continued his personal Holocaust mission. In August 1944, he forced UGIF to supply lists of children in Jewish orphanages and had them deported. Before leaving Paris, he took mothers and babies from the Rothschild Hospital and sent them to the gas chambers. Of the 74,000 Jews deported from France, only 2,500 survived. Drancy was the anteroom of Auschwitz. At the liberation of Paris, the gendarmes who were guarding Drancy changed sides and joined the resistance.
Et alors ce que j'aime, c'est que dès qu'il y a eu la libération du camp, ils avaient des brassards France d'abord. Ça a été ma première vision de ma libération. France d'abord, la police française et les gendarmes. J'étais un peu étonnée, mais ensuite j'ai su quand même que la police française avait pris les armes et s'était mis contre les Allemands quand même. Donc j'ai compris après. Mais ça a été quelque chose de terrible pour moi de voir les gendarmes qui, quelques jours avant, nous gardaient encore à la porte et s'étaient mis des brassards France d'abord.
C'est indéniable que dans sa grande majorité, la police comme la gendarmerie se sont mis au service des hitlériens. Mais ils se sont mis au service des hitlériens parce que Vichy, Pétain et toute la haute administration française étaient les héritiers de la politique de capitulation devant Hitler d'avant-guerre.
In 1976, 32 years after the liberation of Paris, a monument to the deported Jews was erected at Drancy. Years after being deported by the French, Eric Rosen returned to Drancy.
Nightmares are occurring. I'm not only thinking about Auschwitz, but I'm thinking about my experience in Nice, my experience in Drancy. And I remember, I can see sometimes at night when I dream of the barracks that I slept in Drancy. Some governments in Europe, they were forced to do it. But my personal feeling is the French like to do it. They did it with a little bit more fervor than other countries. Like we say in America, they went against the Jews with gusto.
Et je vais vous dire une chose. J'ai 74 ans. J'ai été avocat à la Cour de Paris, membre du Conseil de l'Ordre. Je suis maintenant conseiller d'État en service extraordinaire. Quand je passe à côté d'un uniforme de policier, j'ai toujours un petit quelque chose. Je reste marqué pour la vie.
Next week, at a time of mounting public concern about the ethics and methods of the press, we go inside one of Britain's largest news-gathering agencies. Just how far will reporters go to get the big story? Find out on The Tabloid Truth next Wednesday night at 9:30. Coming up, ABC News and Lateline.
A helpless man is brutally bashed.
Mr. Provost, I'm Tina Bertram. I'm prosecuting your case.
And Tina finds she's on a case.
The man's a Darrow? Well, Darrow made wound up at St. V's on life support.
That is not only frustrating,
Mr. Provost, who hit you?
but also moving.
Are they in this courtroom?
Superb Australian drama.
They nearly killed him. Stop it, we're not backing out now.
Janus, 8:30 Thursday, ABC.
In the final Great Performers Concert for '94, ABC Concerts presents the magic of Mendelssohn, Schumann and Stravinsky. Join the Melbourne Symphony under guest conductor Marcello Biotti in the Schumann Piano Concerto, performed by acclaimed pianist Elitsu Viersaladze. Book now for this final 1994 Great Performers Concert, Saturday, 29th of October at the Melbourne Concert Hall on Bass 11500. That's Bass 11500.
Be watching your ABC Friday night. 8 o'clock, he's got 1 foot in the grave.
9 o'clock. 14 more hours before it's time to go to bed.
8:30, it's Woody Allen's classic Midsummer Night's sex comedy.
Make love to me.
10 o'clock, Shadows and Fog.
We expect the killer to strike again tonight.
The killer? What killer?
The strangler.
Then the 39 Steps.
Beautiful, mysterious woman pursued by gunmen. Sounds like a spy story.
That's exactly what it is.
A great night on your ABC.
Good evening, I'm Kerry O'Brien. On Lateline tonight, what are the lessons in 50 years of Liberal Party history that would restore faith in the party now? Liberal Party Federal President Tony Staley looks to the future with party critic Gerard Henderson straight after the news.
Hello and welcome, Clive Hale from the ABC National Newsroom. Thank you for joining us. Leading late edition tonight, Bill Clinton says he's hopeful but watchful after continued reports that Iraqi troops have turned away from the border with Kuwait. But in Kuwait itself, there's little faith in Iraq's latest military move. Kuwait's leaders now want to see all Iraqi troops and heavy weapons excluded from a buffer zone north of the frontier, a call supported by Washington. As allies intensify negotiations in Kuwait, American forces have moved closer to the frontier.
American armour was moving out of Kuwait City, the first combat-ready troops to head north. For soldiers of the 24th Mechanized Infantry Division, the order to roll followed a hard slog. It took these units 2 days to get ready. They had to work fast with very little sleep.
We're going to go today and move away from Kuwait City and actually go out into the field for the first time since we've been here.
Pledging that the US will use its strength to end Iraq's cat-and-mouse game, Washington was ready to deploy a total of 200,000 troops if needed. American and British forces are pouring into the emirate despite Baghdad's assertion that its troops have withdrawn. Kuwait now wants this military muscle to help impose a new exclusion zone for Iraqi ground forces.
The status of hostility between us and the Iraqi regime will continue, and we would like to see them as further north as possible so they will not create any problems for us or any threat to our security.
It's not the first time that many of these US troops are here to help Kuwait. Some are Gulf War veterans. They've been through it before and are fed up with Saddam Hussein.
That's my third trip. I hate every one of them. I say we should have did it right the first time.
Elsewhere, a Patriot missile battery was uncovered and deployed, another layer of protection. On the political front, high-profile visits from Kuwait's friends. British Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd and US Secretary of State Warren Christopher arrived for a series of high-level meetings with the Kuwaiti Emir and other Gulf state leaders.
Israeli and Palestinian officials in the Gaza Strip are searching for a 19-year-old Jewish soldier kidnapped by Hamas guerrillas. Israel has suspended peace negotiations over the kidnapping. The soldier's captors say he'll be killed on Friday if Hamas prisoners aren't released. This videotape released by the group shows a Hamas fighter displaying the soldier's identity card and a ransom note. Israel has retaliated by sealing off the Gaza Strip, and Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin has told Yasser Arafat he bears full responsibility for the soldier's fate. The confrontation comes amid reports the two leaders will share the Nobel Peace Prize to be announced on Friday. First came the Hawke memoirs accusing Paul Keating of reluctance to commit Australians to the Gulf War campaign. Then yesterday the Keating version labelling Bob Hawke a liar. Returning fire today, Bob Hawke claimed he has notes of the exchange, but neither former nor current Prime Minister has been able to elicit support for their version from two government front benchers also at the meeting. Political correspondent Jim Middleton.
Didn't. Now, like boys in the playground, the old rivals are fighting over a place in history, with tit-for-tat claims about lying as their weapons.
Fabrication. The record shows that he is the one
who now, for reasons I don't understand, is lying.
Who said what at Gulf War meetings like this one is in dispute, and Mr Hawke is using notes of one meeting to bolster his assault.
Keating started arguing that we should not do anything. Quote, what has the US ever done for us? End quote. And he cited agricultural trade issues. GE, that's Gareth Evans. Gareth Evans responded well, as did PM in United Nations term. There is a record of what happened.
Mr Hawke may have notes, Gareth Evans says he hasn't, and what's more, that he can't remember.
I have no specific recollection of the particular exchange which is the subject matter of that account in the Hawke memoirs.
I had a look at my CV this morning. It didn't indicate that I was an adjudicator between past and current Prime Ministers, and I don't intend to be.
The federal government has agreed to set up a new aviation safety authority as an independent statutory body and may bring forward its start-up date. The Civil Aviation Authority today grounded Seaview Air, withdrawing approval for the airline's chief pilot after fresh concerns were raised about the company's operations. 9 people died when a Seaview Air Aero commander disappeared on a flight to Lord Howe Island 10 days ago. Today, the airline operations were blocked when Chief Pilot Clive McIver lost his endorsement from the CAA, a move stemming from a letter from a Seaview passenger to Mr Brereton.
Has now been taken. At every point this year, when a question has been raised about Seaview or anything else, there has been prompt and immediate action.
The Transport Minister is himself under increasing pressure over air safety administration, with the Senate voting this afternoon to censure him. The CAA says it's begun an independent investigation into the maintenance, operation and piloting of Seaview aircraft. The High Court has handed down one of the most significant judgments on defamation law in Australian history. In a majority decision recognising free speech rights under the Constitution, the court strengthened media powers to criticise political figures.
Australia's politicians have always been able to dish it out.
Irresponsible, stupid people.
But they haven't always been as willing to take it. Politicians initiate more defamation actions than any other occupation. But that could be about to change following today's High Court decision.
Oh, I think it's a most significant decision. I think it's the most important and significant decision on defamation law in Australia's history.
The case involved a defamation action brought by federal politician Andrew Theophanous against a Victorian newspaper. By a majority of 4-3, the High Court found the Constitution guarantees a discussion of government and political matters, including the performance and integrity of MPs. It said makers of political comment are protected from defamation, so long as the maker of the statements establishes it didn't know the statements were untrue, it didn't publish the statements recklessly, and the publication was reasonable in the circumstances.
Scottish writer James Kelman has won the prestigious Booker Prize. Kelman was presented with the $43,000 award for the novel How Late It Was, How Late. It's a comic tale about an ex-convict who goes on a 2-day drinking binge. Judges argued for more than 2 hours before agreeing on Kelman by a 3-2 majority. South Africa's attempts to rebuild its economy are being overrun by the even worse economic straits of the country's neighbours. Thousands of people are flocking south from Mozambique, arriving at a rate of 1 every 10 minutes.
Even the electrified fence on South Africa's eastern border is no deterrent. Every day there are people desperate enough to crawl through. But once across, the illegal migrants have to get past the Army's border patrol, now committed to the task full-time. The migrants come from Mozambique, one of the world's poorest countries, ravaged by war and still to enjoy free elections. On this side, Africa's most vibrant economy, still basking in the aftermath of freedom. It had been an average night, 25 people caught in one incident. Last year, 7,000 were captured in this 40-mile section of border alone, a fraction of South Africa's land frontier. Alberto Boca came from Xai-Xai province, over 200 miles away.
When we see our people come back from South Africa, we see they are well dressed. They own lots of things and tell us there are great job opportunities in South Africa.
So an army that once fought off what it called the revolutionary onslaught is now kept busy warding off illegal migrants. Yet for every one that is caught, another one slips through, joining the stream of people attracted by the affluence of the cities. But the influx of an estimated 2 million illegal migrants across the country has led to a backlash that borders on xenophobia.
Why all of a sudden an influx into our country, whereby now we get a lot of drugs, we get a lot of forgeries, we get a lot of muggings, to an extent whereby we get a lot of now funny diseases like AIDS and the others.
The migrants compete for jobs, especially in the unskilled sector, precisely where the new government has to show progress. Increasingly aware of the public mood, ministers admit that illegal migration is a threat to future stability. The signs are already there. Hillbrow, once fashionable, now a window into Johannesburg's underworld. An increasing number of the crimes this plainclothes police team deals with involves illegal migrants.
This guy's from Angola, he just robbed.
Calls for tougher immigration laws come from black and white, rich and poor alike. Already the ideal of an open South Africa reaching out to its neighbours is giving way to the reality of nationhood.
Often the arena for all-in brawls, Taiwan's parliament has now given a new meaning to political accountability. Linked to a financial scandal that's rocked Taiwan Stock Exchange, an independent MP stabbed himself 4 times with a fruit knife. Ye Xian-Xiu, a former pop singer, said he wanted to prove his innocence. From a hospital bed, he told television reporters he felt dizzy. In cricket, Australia's won the first one-day international in a series in Pakistan, beating South Africa by just 6 runs. Australia made 6 for 207. In reply, South Africa 8 for 201. Now to finance news, and the rally in share prices stalled today. The All Ordinaries Index closed down 1 point. Overseas, strong gains on the Tokyo market, and in Hong Kong, the Hang Seng was up 170 points. But gold was down by more than $2. On the currency markets, the Australian dollar weakened across the board. And now a brief check of tomorrow's national weather for you. Rain developing for Perth, a possible late storm in Sydney. Should be fine in Adelaide and the other capital cities. Late edition news, I'm Clive Hale. Thank you for being with us around Australia. We're back for you tomorrow night. Meantime, do have a nice evening.
The federal Liberal party's had a decade of disaster. With each new leader and each new loss, the sense of despair has spread to the grassroots.
Well, it's been devastating. I mean, it's been terrible to be a supporter on election day, to be out there at 5 in the morning, rain, hail or shine, and to lose 5 times running.
Now, as the party prepares to celebrate its 50th birthday, a new book on its history says it must change dramatically or collapse. Liberal Blues. That's our story tonight.
Live from Canberra, the ABC's Lateline. Here's Kerry O'Brien.
Welcome to the program. Later this month, 65 members of the Liberal Party's Federal Council will gather for a landmark meeting in Albury, New South Wales. The meeting will mark the 50th anniversary of the Liberal Party's birth. In other circumstances, it might have been a time for real celebration. But in 1994, the Federal Liberal Party has precious little to celebrate. The last 11 years have seen 5 election losses and as many leaders come and go. In that time, there's been no shortage of soul-searching, with 3 major reports asking why the nation's most successful modern political party simply can't win government at a national level. In those reports, a single theme emerges. The party's federal structure is disjointed. It lacks the capacity to develop policy and has little power to influence the choice and quality of political candidates. This structural crisis is taken up with gusto in a new book by former senior Liberal Party advisor, now political commentator, Gerard Henderson. In his book, Menzies' Child, Henderson argues that Liberals have a messiah complex, believing all problems will be solved by a powerful leader. Yet, he says, nobody really runs the Federal Liberal Party. In terms of professionalism, he says the party is outgunned at every level by Labor. In a moment, we'll be joined by Gerard Henderson and Federal Liberal President Tony Staley. But first, this report from Margot O'Neill.
And so they should, you know, because the only way they're going to have a future is to vote Liberal.
Do you care about this country of ours? Will you vote
If
Liberal?
they ever make a movie about the Labor Party machine, it'll be called Goodfellas.
And if they make a movie about the Liberal Party machine, it'll be called Driving Miss Daisy.
It is clear to us now that Labor has won the election.
The Liberals complain they haven't found the right leader to win, but some others believe they haven't even got the right party anymore.
The Labor Party, because of the way the Labor Party internal structures operate, has a culture of conflict. It's an adversarial culture. They contest their pre-selection battles very bitterly. They have a cadre of political operatives who are seasoned outside normal election timetables because of the way the party operates. The Liberal Party is a much more tranquil, tepid political culture. They don't produce people who are as hard-edged. I wouldn't rate the top half dozen people in the Liberal Party as good enough to get a job in the Labor Party.
I once again congratulate the Australian Labor Party and I congratulate...
How did it all go so wrong? 5 election losses in a row, and yet the Conservatives were once the powerhouse of Australian politics.
We represent all the people, not just the ones who voted for us, but the ones who voted against us.
For more than 2 decades under Sir Robert Menzies, the Liberals were synonymous with government and stability. They promoted the growing affluent middle class while trouncing the Labor Party, who they effectively portrayed as outmoded class warriors tied to socialist trade unions. It took Labor 30 years to reinvent itself as a professional middle-class party of economic management. But do the Liberals accept that an equally fundamental transformation is now required of them? Apparently, many don't.
Well, the Liberal Party came out of that 1993 election, and look at what happened. No one was fired, no one was accountable, and no one had had a bad game. They'd just lost an important election, and everything had just gone fine, if you listen to what they had to say about it.
In a new book to mark the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Liberal Party, former Liberal advisor Gerard Henderson says many prominent Liberals show signs of the psychological condition of denial. Gerard Henderson argues that the Liberal Party is in long-term decline, that it has a weak organisation, little history, no tradition of debate, too many politically inexperienced parliamentarians, too few heroes. He and a growing number of analysts believe the biggest problem isn't leadership, but the party's outdated structure. In short, because there's no truly national authoritative organisation, no one really runs a Liberal Party. Liberal historian Dean Jench agrees.
Because the Liberal Party essentially is 9 different divisions. It's a confederation rather than a federation. Sovereignty and authority rests very firmly in the state divisions. There's another basic component of structure, however, that I think is really one of the components of the crisis of the Liberal Party. And that is the fundamental chasm between the parliamentary and the organisational wings. In the Liberal Party, the sovereignty in terms of policy, authority in terms of policy, rests firmly with the parliamentary wing. And it's not surprising that many of those in the organisation, and certainly the Liberal members, are getting a bit restless about this.
Young Liberal John Brogden is a good example of what's right and what's wrong with the Liberals. A gifted media performer and debater, he nevertheless failed to win pre-selection recently in Vaucluse in Sydney.
The problem is that the Liberal Party often doesn't see the need to have those great debaters and the need to have performers, and that disappointed me. That my performance, say in the media and in the Liberal Party forums, was not seen as an advantage.
Henderson also argues that political experience isn't a treasured commodity among Liberals. Too many Liberals delight in denying their politicians at all, or swing on to the Liberal front bench after only a cursory apprenticeship. Compare that to Laborites. Prime Minister Paul Keating and most of his colleagues have been involved in politics and the Labor Party most of their adult lives. The Liberal malaise is evident at every level of the party, including the branches.
So how much debate do you see at your local branch meeting?
Well, not enough, and I want to see more. I'm happy to have our politicians come to our branches and have their views challenged. And they, I think, are happy to have it happen. But for too long, it's been the viewpoint of they are our Liberal Party Member of Parliament. We shouldn't question them too strongly on issues we disagree with them on.
They're embedded in a concept that the Liberal Party is the natural party of government, that change is not really necessary, that things can continue to go on, and the government and the Liberal Party will be returned to government.
Branch members have little say in policy, but they do have the mighty power of pre-selection, and they often send to Canberra mainly like-minded Anglo-Saxon men. Look at the Liberal front bench. No Jews, no one with parents born in a non-Anglo-Celtic country, few women or Catholics. Henderson says it looks pretty much like the Robert Menzies Liberal Party of old. Political consultant Malcolm McGregor, who's worked for both Labor and Liberal parties, recalls how Alexander Downer's future direction statement initially contained no separate reference to women.
I made the observation to one of the officials at the National Secretariat that we didn't have chapters on women and youth in the document. And he was surprised to think that I thought that was an issue. Indeed, he offhandedly said, women are dealt with in the chapter on the family. And I said, well, I don't know where you've been for 25 years, but there's been a social movement called feminism, and a few women out there might be a little peeved to think for women, see family.
Our challenge is to make the Liberal Party's vision live for Australians in the 1990s.
There are moves towards reform. At the 50th anniversary meeting of the Federal Council in Albury later this month, some limited form of federal intervention will be considered. But it's unlikely the party will move for a radical restructuring, even though the corrosive effect of being the perennial loser is obvious.
It's been terrible to be a believer in the Liberal Party, to be a believer in the Liberal philosophy, to be a supporter on election day, to be out there at 5 in the morning, rain, hail or shine, and to lose 5 times running.
The odds against a Liberal victory anytime soon seem overwhelming, short of a Labor Party disaster. But then Robert Menzies worked out in the 1940s that government wouldn't fall into his lap either. He defied all odds by regrouping after being sacked as Prime Minister by his own party. He restructured and renamed the Conservative side of politics and then withstood another election defeat before finally triumphing. 50 years on, the Liberals might again look to his legacy of reform.
That report from Margot O'Neill, and now our guests. Tony Staley has been Federal Liberal President since last year. He's no stranger to controversy, having assisted in the overthrow of then Liberal leader Billy Snedden and his replacement by Malcolm Fraser in 1975, and then publicly withdrawing his support for John Hewson just before he lost the leadership earlier this year. He was a cabinet minister in Malcolm Fraser's government, and Tony Staley joins us from Melbourne. Dr. Gerard Henderson is Executive Director of the Sydney Institute, a privately funded think tank. He writes regular columns for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age and is the author of several books, including Menzies' Child, a history of the Liberal Party, which will be launched on Friday. During the mid-80s, Dr. Henderson worked as Chief of Staff for former Liberal Party leader John Howard, and he's in Sydney tonight. Gerard Henderson, the message from your book is a tough one. So tough, I would suggest, that it's easy to imagine any Liberal who actually accepts what you argue wanting to bare the wrist and reach for the razor blade.
Well, it's tough, but it's honest. And as I was doing this book, what I noted that a number of the criticisms I have been making over years, and as have some others commenting on the party and some within the party, is not dissimilar from the message that Robert Menzies gave 50 years ago when he started up the party. What Menzies said then was, look, Labor is better organised, Labor has better personnel, Labor has periodicals and magazines in the party that give a line from Broome to Rockhampton, so Labor people picking up the line can run with the line. What he said was, our party, then the UAP, about to become the Liberal Party, is not performing well, that's why we're losing, and we need to reform. Now, what I note among successive Liberal leaders, and there have been, as your introduction shows, there have been so many in recent times, but successive Liberal leaders, including the current Liberal leader, Alexander Downer, have not shown that desire, that understanding of the urgency of significant, substantial and widespread reform. And I think until that is understood, the Liberals are destined to perform poorly. I'm not saying they will never win, but they'll certainly lose more than they'll win until there is substantial reform.
Tony Staley, a broad response from you first before we narrow the focus on a few specifics.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that so many of the things that Gerard's written about are matters on which I would agree. We are, in fact, doing a great deal about a lot of those issues. I do not feel pessimistic. I believe that we are grappling with the sort of issues relating to professionalism, to looking at federal powers, to the question of a think tank, to issues that I suppose are summed up in some of the recent announcements. I mean, I only recently announced that we're setting up a Menzies research centre, and it's the first time we've had such a centre. It is a national centre, and that will encourage debate, will encourage argument and discussion within the party. It's got a very significant charter. I don't suggest to you that in 5 minutes it'll revolutionise the world, but it will mean that we will debate issues in a tough-minded sense, because without facing issues, without being a party of ideas, certainly a party does die. And we will be doing this not in the context of leadership argument and debate and discussion, which has so often created difficulties for us, particularly in the 80s, but we will be doing it within an utterly legitimate context where ideas are legitimate. And that's just been announced. Things like the selection of Petrov Georgiou for Menzies' old seat of Kooyong, I think, show that we value professionalism, and he was selected as a Greek Australian, a brilliant Greek Australian, also a great party professional. And it's not as if he's the first party professional to go into Parliament in recent years. We've had Nick Minchin, David Kemp. I do accept...
Jim Carlton.
Yeah, Jim Carlton, some period before that. I accept, in short, the need for creating an environment where those who work for the party, whether it be for ministers, shadow ministers, the organisation, can see their way through to a parliamentary career and ultimately to senior cabinet positions and even the leadership, of course. So, you know, in short, I say to Gerard, much that you've written in your book, Gerard, concerns me, but I have to say to you that we are doing a great deal about those sorts of issues.
Gerard Henderson, I know that one of the key points, it seems to me, in your book was where you say that it's been most comfortable, the Liberal Party, with a philosophy of opposition over the years, of being anti-Labor and anti-socialist rather than particularly pro-anything. You say that every time the Conservative parties have faced a competently led and professionally organised Labor Party, they've struggled. You clearly argue that too many Liberals don't really stand for anything. That's a fairly devastating critique.
Yes, it's a tough critique. Nick Greiner has also made a similar critique of the Liberal Party, but I think it's pretty correct. If you look, when Labor was professionally organised and competent at the national level, it wasn't often because it had so many splits, but I'm thinking about the period of the Curtin government in the early 40s, early to mid-40s, and the early stages of the Chifley government, but not when he went down the socialist road. And in the 1980s again and into the early 90s, on both those occasions, the UAP, the United Australia Party in the 40s, and the Liberal Party today have struggled. And it was very easy for the Liberals to say we're anti-socialist, we're anti-regulation, when Labor was very socialist and very regulatory. It isn't anymore. It's a different party now. And the Liberals have had a problem in Australia carving out their own identity, their own position. A much greater problem here than the Conservatives have had in Britain or the American Republicans have had in the United States. Now, I think this goes back to a tradition of a lack of debate and discussion that goes back beyond the formation of the Liberal Party in 1944 to really to the early days of federation. But until the cultural problems as well as the organisational problems are recognised, reform's going to be very slow. Now, I recognise and I appreciate what Tony Staley has said and what Tony Staley has done over the last year when he's been federal president. But it's only a very small reform. I mean, there is talk about the creation of a think tank in the Federal Secretariat. That's all very well, but as I understand it right now, there are 17 people working in the Federal Secretariat, and yet the Federal Party has no great say over policy or any other matter. I mean, what are they all doing? What's happened in the last 10 years before Tony Staley arrived that no one actually ever thought of doing something along these lines? So what I'm concerned about is, whilst there are some people like Tony Staley talking about reform, and John Velder did, to be fair to him, in the early 80s as well, little has happened. And if you just look at the Federal Secretariat, my last visit down there, I mean, I think it's refurbishations have been something like $2 million, but when I looked around, I still can't find a library, but they have a terrific kitchen.
Tony Staley.
Well, I mean, it's that I regard as a pretty trivial point, because I have to say that the quality of work which they undertake there, the sort of approach they take to research, to understanding of the intricacies of politics, I suspect is not that different from what you'd find at Labor Party headquarters. I think there are perceptions here. I mean, they've been in office for the last 11 years, and I think they, in terms of perceptions, benefit from that. But I'd have to say that I think there are some very, very competent professional people in the Liberal organisation, not only in Canberra, but throughout the country.
But then why do you need this special think tank that's going to provide you a policy debate that you don't seem to have been able to have had within the party before?
It's something that we should have had years and years ago.
But why do you need that to spark debate, proper policy debate?
It's the most appropriate way of doing this. Other parties like ourselves around the world have done just this sort of thing. It astonishes me that the party didn't do it years ago, and that's why I undertook to look at it when I became, if I became federal president. We have done, and I'm delighted to say I got overwhelming support not only from federal executive but from the parliamentary party.
What about that point that the broad point that Gerard Henderson makes, that you have been more comfortable historically as a party with a philosophy of opposition, anti-Labor, anti-socialist, and there's that extraordinary quote from Tony Eggleton, who ran the Liberal Party Secretariat for 15 years until 1990, who explained to Gerard Henderson that he declined party pre-selection over those years for a place in the Parliament because he always felt that he could, quote, get up in the House and debate either side of an issue. In other words, what did he stand for?
Well, that, I mean, he served very well in his day, and I don't want to criticise Tony.
Was he indicative? The point that Gerard Henderson is making, was he indicative?
I suppose in a sense you could argue that we've inherited problems because of those years. Now, that sort of spirit's gone. Andrew Robb is a very professional person who desperately believes in what he's on about, and I think has a very professional approach to it. If you can, but Tony, for his day, Tony Eggleton was a good federal director. Times have changed. Now, let me say, one thing that has been overlooked to date is that as I became federal president, the party, having looked at some reforms, had decided to institute a policy partnership. Now, this is quite a new approach where all matters of election policy have to be taken before the outside organisation before they go to approval in the parliamentary party. Now, we're not suggesting that we want outside control, but we have now institutionalised discussion between the politicians and the organisation. At the same time, we, for the first time ever, every month or two, we are circularising all branches and seeking their input. And we're getting some fantastic input from hundreds and hundreds of branches throughout Australia.
But you don't have a structure for that, do you? You don't have a formal structure.
Well, what I'm saying is we have built a structure to do these things. We're looking at further structural amendments in the coming Federal Council, and I very much hope that Federal Council will agree to giving some reserve powers to the Federal Executive. And
what reserve powers?
Well, the areas that we're looking at are the powers of the Federal Executive in the event of a state being in serious financial mismanagement, and also we're looking at some ideas in the area of extreme cases of pre-selection of candidates.
Now, how strongly will you fight for those reforms?
I'm very keen to see us take those matters very seriously. And we've had a lot of discussion about these matters, and I expect to see some development in at least one of those areas. Now,
But how critical are these reforms when you say some development in one of those areas? You've already got, for example, Richard Court from Western Australia as one state leader who's already stuck his head up and said, this sounds like nasty centralism to me, we can't have this. Yeah, I mean, you are going to meet resistance, aren't you?
Yeah, sure. But what I say is that a state branch of the party, we're not suggesting we should play around in their state parliament and state government arrangements, but we are also a national party, and we have national interests, and it seems to me it is time for the Federal Executive to have some powers to reflect the fact that we are also a national party. And there are other sorts of matters that I'd like to look at to involve the wide reaches of the party. going beyond the sort of issues we've already discussed. I mean, things like from time to time having a national convention or conference.
From time to time?
Yes, I don't mean you do it every 6 months because it's very expensive.
What about every 2 years?
Labour have one every, yes, I mean that sort of thing on a regular basis. These are the sorts of things that I've taken to the party, that the party's very seriously looking at, and I must say not only members of the organisation but also our parliamentary friends.
But if I just make a point here, Kerry, I think the problem is right now, and I recognise that the importance of some of those changes, they all should have been done a long time ago, and they still haven't got up, and Tony Stowley's moving in the right direction. But the central problem remains that at the Federal Liberal Party, we're talking about the National Liberal Party, nobody runs it. Nobody's in control. Now, even in its worst times, and it had a lot of very bad times, in the Labor Party in the 50s and the 60s, it still had a federal structure. So when a reformist leader came along like Gough Whitlam, he made many mistakes, but he did set about a process of reform which was taken up by Bill Hayden and by Bob Hawke and others.
But surely
Menzies
ran the Liberal Party nationally. Surely,
and
Fraser ran the National Party.
Fraser ran the party. He ran the government. Now, I'm not quite sure what Jared's meaning.
Okay.
I mean, let
me tell you what I mean. I'll just get him to elaborate, Tony. I'll just get him to elaborate.
Well, what you basically have is 6 branches. You have 6 parties. And when you're in government, you have a strong Prime Minister. The party has a messiah complex. It looks to a strong Prime Minister, and Menzies and Fraser were both strong Prime Ministers and is happy to go along. But in my view, you test political skills in opposition when you have to do your own policy work, when you don't have advisors, when you don't have the public service and other talented people giving you ideas and input. Now, in opposition, over 9 years, the Liberals have performed abysmally. The Liberals are still in opposition, and now, just let me finish for a minute, now there is talk of tentative reforms. Well and good, but in my case, in my submission, tentative reforms are not good enough.
But Jared, they're not tentative. I mean, they're not the slightest bit tentative. There is nothing tentative about establishing a think tank. There is nothing tentative about a policy partnership which
Tony,
involves the whole organisation.
I mean, I've spoken around the Liberal Party on this as well. I understand quite, and I support the concept, but I understand quite clearly that it won't be an independent body because the parliamentarians and the state organisations do not want a think tank of the kind of the Evatt Foundation, which is independently run, independently financed, and free to say what it likes. There will be restrictions on it because the party is still not comfortable with debate and discussion, and I welcome the changes you're trying to make it comfortable. Okay. But there will be restrictions on it.
Okay, well, I mean, obviously we haven't got time to go into in detail, but it is a major reform. The policy partnership is a major reform. Looking at powers for the federal executive are major reforms.
Yes, but they'll become major reforms once they're passed. And again, I'd ask you, how confident are you that these will be passed?
I will be surprised.
That is, reserve powers to intervene on state branches on serious matters, powers to intervene on some pre-selections in particular cases.
I will be surprised if we don't get something up.
Yes,
now,
you're very coy about that.
We just talked a moment ago about nobody runs the party. I mean, if you look, say, at the recent Labor Federal Conference. What happened there? I mean, there's no way in which Keating got his agenda. Who ran that show? Did Keating run that show? And in terms of policy...
You can't say he didn't get his agenda. He lost on uranium.
Yeah, but look, for the rest, it was a case of catching up to policies which we've had and been parading for years.
Mm-hmm. But there were factions. I mean, as I look at the Federal Party, I mean, and I'm talking about the Federal Party, not the state parties, which do better. But if you look at the Federal Party, I mean, what you really have there, particularly in the Parliamentary Party, is a whole lot of individuals who are not organised in any particular faction and who don't really have a great core belief. And therefore, reform becomes very difficult.
This core belief, I wanted to get back to this, Jared, this business about the core belief, because you used Eggleton in the book as one illustration. Now, Eggleton was there from 75 to 90. If Eggleton is a good case to run, I mean, how indicative is the Eggleton example of the state of the party today in terms of individual Liberals having core beliefs and core philosophy and core values?
I recognise it's hard for the Liberal Party because the Labor Party has moved to the centre. But it was hard for the Labor Party in the 50s and the 60s for different reasons. But what I found about doing this book was so many Liberals said to me, are not really political.
And there are still senior Liberals in the states and federal governments who say they're not really political. David Tonkin said to me, Paul Hasluck said it to me, Terry Griffiths, who until recently was a senior minister in New South Wales, says he doesn't really want to be called a politician. John Hewson said he was a non-political leader. Yeah. Nick Greiner, who I think is the best of the Liberals of the current generation, also said he was a non-political leader.
But does that mean they didn't have core beliefs or core values?
Can I chime in here and say it is a sad reflection on politicians that they say they are not political. I am proud to be political. I'm proud to be party political. And we've got to get some correct thinking, if you like, in the Liberal Party about politics, in praise of politics.
Does that mean you agree with Gerard Henderson's point there?
Oh, look, I certainly think there's a great deal in what Gerard said. I mean, politics is a noble profession. And liberalism is a political belief which has stood the test of time and which is still relevant to the people of Australia. But I would say that I think Gerard may be a little hard, because I think the thing is, most of my parliamentary colleagues, they have mainstream beliefs, and they are on the whole liberals, and we don't factionalise because we don't have, I suggest, quite the extremes. We get a big range, but we don't sit as easily in different camps as Labor. So therefore,
but fashions prevail, Tony. I'll give you one example.
Sure.
I think Nick Minchin was one of the good Liberal state administrators in South Australia, and when he criticises the party on the organisational side, he makes a lot of sense. He recently wrote an article for The Australian on policy, where he said that support for the Republic was support for a left-wing cause. Now, by that he means Nick Greiner's a raving lefty. Now, what I'm saying is that, I mean, if you take a crucial issue, I think, among the young in Australia, and among those from non-Anglo-Saxon backgrounds, which is a Republican issue, there is a lot of fashionable input which stops genuine debate developing, as I understand it, people like John Brogden. One of the reasons why bright young people who should be accommodated in the party are losing out on pre-selections is because they get a question: do you support do you believe that under any circumstances at any time Australia should become a republic? And if you answer yes, you've pretty well lost the pre-selection. Now, that certainly happened in parts of New South Wales where Tony Abbott and Bronwyn Bishop's view is being prevailing. Now, what I'm saying is that whilst those cultural problems remain, there will be difficulty encouraging bright young people to come into the party and to win seats and to move forward.
Brief response, Tony Stowe.
Matters like that need addressing.
Well, that's a fairly brief response. I'll give you another go now. When you sit down at the Federal Council, what sense of urgency will you be trying to convey?
Considerable.
That's
considerable.
That's a fantastic wind-up.
Considerable.
It sure beats having to hit people over the head with a hammer to get them to stop at the end. Thank you both very much for joining us tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.
Now let's take a look at what's making headlines in tomorrow's newspapers. Sydney's Telegraph Mirror raises problems surrounding Seaview Air and the Aero Commander aircraft that crashed, killing 9 people 10 days ago. It claims the plane's engines were on their last legs and a pilot reported they lacked power. The Herald has another angle on Seaview, claiming the pilot of the crashed plane appeared to be flying without a valid licence. The Herald also examines a revolutionary High Court decision on defamation and constitutional rights to comment on political figures. The Australian calls the decision a historic extension of free speech. The Financial Review banners the same judgment, which it says protects the media, provided their actions could be shown to be honest, reasonable and not reckless. The Age details the deepening rift between Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, with Mr Hawke's comments that the Prime Minister was, quote, literally crazy and talking codswallop over his version of a pre-Gulf War meeting. The Herald Sun leads with the same story and each man's claim that the other is a liar. That's all for tonight. Tomorrow, John Button, the little big man of the Hawke Labor government and now a roving Australian ambassador in Asia, with a new book out, Will These Books Ever Stop? Button reflects on a decade of change and the challenges of the 90s. In government, he won a reputation as a straight talker, and he talks to us tomorrow night. In the meantime, good night.
And so they should, you know, because the only way they're going to have a future is to vote Liberal.
Do you care about this country of ours?
Our challenge is to make the Liberal Party's vision live for Australians in the 1990s.
maximum return for your investment. Maximum information on the local and world economy. The latest figures live from New York. And profiles on business and management. Why wait till Sunday? Maxine McHugh and Max Walsh bring you The Bottom Line. 8 a.m. Saturday and 11 p.m. Sunday.
From Darwin, Australia, live by satellite across Southeast Asia, this is the Australia Television News.
Hello, Rosemary Church with news from Australia Television. In this bulletin, rebel leaders fail to arrive at the Bougainville peace talks, and tensions ease as Iraqi troops pull back from the Kuwaiti border. But first, in Pakistan, 12 people have been killed and more than 30 injured in unrest aimed at toppling Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. Opposition leader Nawaz Sharif ordered the national strike and describes it as a success, but the government has dismissed the claim. Although Pakistani authorities have arrested more than 1,000 opposition activists in the past few days, widespread unrest and violence is continuing. Gunfire broke out in some cities, with reports of one death and several injuries. Another 5 people were killed during a separate protest, while road transport across the country has been stopped. The government is clamping down on the strikers, increasing the police presence in many cities and continuing a ban on protest marches. Authorities are also playing down the impact of the strike, despite opposition claims of success. Opposition leader Nawaz Sharif called the strike part of an ongoing attempt to oust Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. But so far, the Prime Minister has stood firm, refusing to resign despite the increasing bloodshed. The Bougainville Peace Conference has hit a new hurdle, with rebel leaders failing to arrive at the talks and demanding the total withdrawal of PNG forces from the disputed island. The talks were further disrupted when a member of the Bougainville Revolutionary Army was shot and wounded by a PNG soldier close to where the peace conference is being held. We apologise for the poor sound quality on this report from Sean Dorney in Aroa.
For the third day running, the conference adjourned early, with discussions still revolving around the first issue, peace. Hundreds of young BRA members filed into the tightly secured conference today, some wearing their bush bandanas, and they cheered loudly when the BRA commander from the Pongara area, Ismail Tororama, said Francis Owner and the other leaders would only attend if the PNG security forces were withdrawn completely from the province. Yesterday, Ismail was cheered when he said Owner would show up today, but he never did.
Organisers of the Asian Games in Hiroshima have demanded athletes surrender their passports and obey a curfew after at least 10 competitors went missing. A nationwide search is on in Japan to find the athletes, who authorities believe may have disappeared to find illegal jobs.
Athletes from up to 5 countries have gone missing from the Games village in Hiroshima. Security patrols were immediately increased, but it was too late to stop competitors from Pakistan, Sri Lanka and Nepal absconding. It's believed members of the Iranian and Yemeni teams may also have gone in search of illegal jobs. All left their passports behind with team officials, using the excuse that they were going shopping. At an emergency meeting, Games officials demanded a curfew on athletes and the confiscation of their passports. Japanese police have rushed reinforcements to ports, railway stations and airports, but it's thought unlikely the missing competitors will try to leave the country. Japan relaxed its strict immigration laws for the Games, but 3 large groups of illegal immigrants have already been caught trying to enter the country by pretending they were athletes.
The World Health Organization is sending a team of experts to India to investigate the cause of the country's recent plague outbreak. As Savitri Chowdhury reports from New Delhi, there's been another death from the plague, but the number of new cases has fallen sharply.
Another death was reported from Jamnagar, a town near Surat, the western city where the outbreak of pneumonic plague first occurred some 3 weeks ago. Surat was the worst hit by the epidemic, with over 800 suspected cases and some 50 deaths from this highly contagious disease. But health officials say only one new case was reported in the city over the last 24 hours, and the epidemic is now well under control across the country. WHO Director General Hiroshi Nakajima, who was recently here, agrees it's safe to travel to India, but advises travelers to avoid Surat and areas adjoining it. Another team of experts from WHO is expected to arrive here later this week to investigate the cause of the outbreak of plague in the country after a gap of almost 3 decades.
The United States has warned China to speed up talks on opening its market to the US or miss admission to the World Trade Organization GATT. China is also under pressure to stop counterfeiting and protect commercial copyrights and has been given until the end of the year to come to an agreement. After 2 days of talks between the two countries, the US announced little progress has been made.
The United States intends to be flexible where it can be flexible, but we must insist that China also respond with appropriate flexibility.
The US says counterfeit products cost its companies $1 billion a year in lost income. On the streets of Beijing, counterfeit compact discs and fake Coca-Cola are readily available. Now the US is stepping up pressure on China to protect copyrights and open its markets, and says unless the ultimatum is met quickly, China won't be admitted to GATT.
If it is to realize its accession or the completion of negotiation by December 31, 1994, then we would suggest that China put its foot on the gas pedal.
China has already opened its car market, but the US isn't happy, claiming Chinese industrial policies conflict with GATT rules. The American warship Bentleigh has arrived in Manila to prepare for the 50th anniversary of World War II landings on Leyte, southeast of Manila. The ceremonies will mark the 1944 invasion, which set in motion the liberation of the Philippines from 3 years of Japanese occupation. The Bentleigh was last in the Philippines 2 years ago when it carried away the last of the US troops stationed in the country. In China, some of the world's rarest artefacts have gone on public display. A visiting US delegation is in the country viewing the ancient treasures for a Chinese exhibition in Tennessee next year.
This is the largest and most important exhibition ever to come from the People's Republic of China to the United States.
Among the artefacts, a 3-kilogram dragon and phoenix crown, one of only 3 in the world, and valued at more than $2 million.
Those exclusively used by the emperors.
In Vietnam, several government ministries have been placed on a war footing to deal with widespread destruction caused by flooding on the Mekong River. As Australia Television's Christopher Kremer reports, international donors have begun giving aid for up to 200,000 people left homeless by the floods.
Australia is the first country to give aid to Vietnam's flood victims, and the Australian money will soon be buying food and relief supplies needed by the 20,000 families worst affected. Moved by the worst floods in 3 decades, the government here has earmarked $18 million as grants and concessional loans to save lives and rehabilitate the country's most important agricultural region. It's banned profiteering on essential foods, and health authorities have been told to make sure there are no epidemics.
Indonesian police have clashed with residents of a central Jakarta suburb in a bid to clear the way for demolition work. As Michael Maher reports from Jakarta, around 300 houses and shacks have now been bulldozed to allow a building project to go ahead.
Tear gas was used to disperse hundreds of residents of the Ben Hill district who were protesting about having to leave their homes. The government says it intends to build new low-cost housing on the demolition site, which will be offered to former residents at a reduced rate. But many of those residents are unhappy with the compensation packages offered them and are concerned about finding alternative accommodation. Stones were thrown at the demolition teams as they began their work, and one bulldozer was set on fire. A number of members of Indonesia's parliament had called for a postponement of the demolition work, but without success. Land disputes are becoming increasingly common in Indonesia as the booming local building sector looks for space for its projects.
The United States says Iraqi troops are pulling back from the border with Kuwait, easing military tensions in the Gulf. But President Clinton has moved to ensure the threat doesn't arise again, with reports the US has demanded Iraq withdraw all troops above the 32nd parallel to create a demilitarised buffer zone. To support the demand, the massive American military build-up is continuing.
On Iraqi television, the main highway south of Basra, and not an Iraqi soldier to be seen. In the sand, military positions clearly deserted. And on trains and convoys heading north, thousands of soldiers leaving the region. But American satellite photos from last week showed a considerable Iraqi force.
There has been no change in the pattern of Iraqi activity from yesterday. And so we will continue our deployments.
But Iraqi officials insist the president was wrong, that almost all the troops had in fact left the Kuwaiti border.
Well, I can confirm that the troops have already been moved to another area, except for 2 regiments that are still there and will be moving within the next 24 hours.
It was eventually left to the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to confirm a withdrawal was underway.
The latest information we have now indicates that there's fairly broad movement for most of those units that had been brought down south.
The withdrawal raises new questions for US President Bill Clinton. How far must the Iraqis retreat? Will the US try to impose a demilitarized zone in southern Iraq? And just how long is the president prepared to leave US troops on the ground in Kuwait? So far, 19,000 US troops are in the Gulf. 44,000 more are on the way. Another 150,000 are on standby. The US thinks the sheer weight of numbers foiled an attack.
There's absolutely no doubt in my mind at all. This wasn't just some innocent exercise that they were on and that we somehow misread that.
The Pentagon says it's too early to declare the crisis over. The next step is likely to occur in the UN Security Council as the international community decides how to stop Iraq threatening Kuwait again.
In Kuwait, there's still deep suspicion of the Iraqi manoeuvres, but the mood has changed from fear to belligerence. As Debbie Whitmont reports, there have been widespread calls for a final reckoning with Saddam Hussein.
The immediate fear has faded, but the big guns are still arriving. The USS Tripoli, flagship of a task force of 4,000 Americans. These troops will stay offshore. They're waiting to know whether their mission has already been completed.
My feeling is that we may have been successful at our mission of deterring Iraqi aggression in this particular case.
But Kuwait is calling for blood. Retreat trick, shouted today's Kuwait Times. In another paper, let there be war and a final bone-cracking blow to the head of the Iraqi regime.
Saddam Hussein, he is nothing. I think this is the last time for him.
Whether Iraq intended an invasion or just wanted to stir up trouble, Saddam Hussein has shown he can still grab world attention. For many Kuwaitis, that's justification for dealing with him once and for all. Kuwait's been reassured by its allies. The threat of war has receded. The war of words is hotting up. Here, few are convinced by the promise of an Iraqi backdown. During the occupation 4 years ago, these Kuwaitis worked as an underground, keeping oil fields running for the Iraqis but passing information to the allies. Last night at a Diwania, a men's get-together, they told us the United States should finish what it began in the Gulf War.
Saddam Hussein and his people, they just lie. They don't have, I don't know how they can face the whole world and keep people just blaming words. Whether they pull or not, they have to be stopped.
But there was relief. A slightly different Diwania held by Australian women. Some foreigners have left Kuwait, but most have stayed on.
I have the bags packed if we need to go, and the car's full of petrol and there's food and water. But I'm not worried at all.
Most here had made plans to drive to the Saudi border. Now they're keeping their suitcases packed. Inside them, for emergencies, are buyers, the black robes worn by Saudi women.
An Australian freelance cameraman has experienced the Gulf tensions firsthand. Robbie Wright was one of a group of foreigners held at gunpoint near the Iraqi border. Their bus was stopped by soldiers, some passengers were beaten, and all were stripped and left by the roadside.
Robbie Wright has seen his share of tight scrapes. Until recently, he was based in Sarajevo for the American Broadcasting Company. But last night, around 9:30 on the road from Baghdad to Basra, he found himself looking down the barrel of an Iraqi soldier's rifle.
We were stripped of our underwear and robbed and forced to lie face down on the side of the road. There was probably about 15 Iraqi government officials with us, and they were pistol whipped and smacked around a bit.
The group was being escorted by Iraqi officials, keen to show the Western media that Iraq was pulling back from the Kuwait border. But Iraqi soldiers were eager to make a different point.
They were just rebel troops, just rebel Iraqi troops that sick and tired of sanctions and wanted to get a point across.
Robbie Wright spoke to his father and explained the ordeal, saying the soldiers stole the foreigners' clothes and equipment and shot out the tyres of the bus.
I certainly wouldn't like to be there. I wouldn't like to see too many Aussie soldiers over there either.
But Robbie and his father couldn't overlook the comic ending.
I believe they got to Basra in their underwear and had to find some accommodation.
The Hilton, I believe. Checking in, under decks, and that was about it. I don't think I'd get away with it in Brisbane somehow.
John Wright says the incident hasn't soured his son's return to the Middle East.
The Middle East peace process has stalled, with Israel suspending talks after the kidnapping of an Israeli soldier by the Islamic militant group Hamas. This videotape released by the group shows a Hamas fighter displaying the soldier's identity card and a ransom note. Israel has retaliated by sealing off the Gaza Strip, and Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin told Yasser Arafat he bears full responsibility for the soldier's fate. The confrontation comes amid reports the two leaders will share the Nobel Peace Prize, to be announced on Friday. Plans for the reconstruction of South Africa's economy are being put at risk by a flood of illegal immigrants. Fleeing poverty and disease, thousands of people are arriving in South Africa from neighbouring Mozambique in search of new jobs and a new life.
Even the electrified fence on South Africa's eastern border is no deterrent. Every day there are people desperate enough to crawl through. But once across, the illegal migrants have to get past the Army's border patrol, now committed to the task full-time. The migrants come from Mozambique, one of the world's poorest countries, ravaged by war and still to enjoy free elections. On this side, Africa's most vibrant economy, still basking in the aftermath of freedom. It had been an average night, 25 people caught in one incident. Last year, 7,000 were captured in this 40-mile section of border alone, a fraction of South Africa's land frontier. Alberto Boca came from Xai-Xai province, over 200 miles away.
When we see our people come back from South Africa, we see they are well dressed. They own lots of things and tell us there are great job opportunities in South Africa.
So an army that once fought off what it called the revolutionary onslaught is now kept busy warding off illegal migrants. Yet for every one that is caught, another one slips through, joining the stream of people attracted by the affluence of the cities. But the influx of an estimated 2 million illegal migrants across the country has led to a backlash that borders on xenophobia.
Why all of a sudden an influx into our country, whereby now we get a lot of drugs, we get a lot of forgeries, we get a lot of margins, to an extent whereby we get a lot of now funny diseases like AIDS and the others.
The migrants compete for jobs, especially in the unskilled sector, precisely where the new government has to show progress. Increasingly aware of the public mood, ministers admit that illegal migration is a threat to future stability. The signs are already there. Hillbrow, once fashionable, now a window into Johannesburg's underworld. An increasing number of the crimes this plainclothes police team deals with involves illegal migrants.
This guy's from Angola, he's just robbed.
Calls for tougher immigration laws come from black and white, rich and poor alike. Already the ideal of an open South Africa reaching out to its neighbours is giving way to the reality of nationhood.
Australia's High Court has set new boundaries for free speech and redefined the media's ability to criticise political figures. By a slender majority, the court found the Australian Constitution protects political commentators from being sued for defamation.
Australia's politicians have always been able to dish it out.
Irresponsible, stupid people.
But they haven't always been as willing to take it. Politicians initiate more defamation actions than any other occupation. But that could be about to change following today's High Court decision.
Oh, I think it's a most significant decision. I think it's the most important and significant decision on defamation law in Australia's history.
The case involved a defamation action brought by federal politician Andrew Theophanous against a Victorian newspaper. By a majority of 4-3, the High Court found the Constitution guarantees the discussion of government and political matters, including the performance and integrity of MPs. It said makers of political comment are protected from defamation, so long as the maker of the statements establishes it didn't know the statements were untrue, it didn't publish the statements recklessly, and the publication was reasonable in the circumstances. The decision's as broad as it is significant. It applies to anyone involved in political discussion, which could include everybody from trade unionists to Aboriginal activists, as well as politicians. It potentially opens such public figures up to much greater scrutiny, provided the media isn't maliciously or recklessly false in what it publishes.
This will have not only an effect on the technical law of defamation, but it will also mean that journalists will feel freer to comment on political matters.
But critics of the judgment, including the politician at its centre, are disappointed by the finding.
There's some problem with defamation laws. They should be reformed for all people. And it should not be the case that you have a situation where you have one set of defamation laws for the public and another set of laws or another set of criteria for public and political figures.
The exact parameters of the decision are yet to be determined, and it will take more High Court decisions before the full implications of today's judgment become clear.
Time now for a look at Wednesday's finance news. And shares in Tokyo continued their upward climb, investors inspired by an advance on US markets. Hong Kong stocks soared 2% in strong overseas buying. Following suit, a rally on the Singapore Stock Exchange saw the STI adding 23 points. Spectacular rallies on offshore markets failed to inspire Australian shares, the All Ordinaries closing down nearly 2 points. The country's dollar slipped against the US currency, while Hong Kong gold and Australian bullion lost ground. Scientists have made a breakthrough in their quest to ease the impact of drought on Australian farmers. They've discovered a phenomenon in the Indian Ocean which has intensified the drought currently devastating Australia's eastern states and may be able to predict wet and dry seasons within 5 years.
Drought ravaging eastern Australia has always been blamed on the reversal of winds and ocean currents in the Pacific, known as El Niño. But oceanographic researchers at the CSIRO in Hobart have found another phenomenon in the Indian Ocean that's causing farmers hardship. When waters between northwestern Australia and Indonesia were warm, the drought was confined to Queensland and northern New South Wales. But now they've dropped to record low temperatures.
What we found this year, as the cold spot developed, the drought spread southward and into Victoria and into Tasmania.
Scientists have discovered the cold spot extends a kilometre below the surface and is influenced by strong currents.
Based on this understanding, we'll have the capability to develop new methods of predicting climate and predicting Australia's rainfall patterns that will be based on Indian Ocean currents.
Within 5 years, meteorologists should be able to forecast heavy rain and drought 6 to 12 months ahead.
With these forecasts, farmers can take into account, can plan ahead with regard to the various things they have to do. There's their crops, they have to make decisions as to what to plant and when to plant.
As for the drought, scientists don't expect it to break until early next year.
Now for a look at Thursday's weather forecast. And storms and 35 degrees in Bangkok. Storms also for Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. Fine and 33 in Jakarta. Also fine in Ho Chi Minh City and Hong Kong. Cloudy and 29 for Taipei. In Australia, partly cloudy for Christmas and the Cocos Islands. Apart from a late storm for Sydney and rain in Perth, the rest of the country should be fine. 19 in Melbourne, 28 for Adelaide.
Now, recapping the main stories in this bulletin. 12 people killed and more than 30 injured in Pakistan during unrest aimed at toppling Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. Rebel leaders failed to arrive for talks at the Bougainville Peace Conference and demand the total withdrawal of PNG forces from the disputed island. And tensions ease in the Gulf as Iraqi troops pull back from the border with Kuwait. And that's the news from Australia Television for the moment. I'm Rosemary Church. Bye for now.
Here's a great Woody Allen double.
Could you get me a headache tablet?
First, Woody's a sex-starved inventor.
Make love to me.
Surrounded by heaps of randy friends.
I slept with your wife.
Then, right after...
We expect the killer to strike again tonight.
The killer? What killer?
The Strangler.
A brilliant tribute to film noir.
Lives